Chapter 36, Act 36, The Maenad's Tale. Act 36, The Maenad's Tale. The Mission. Yang paused, his stare locked on Rydia and Ursula's retreating forms as Ursula turned to give one last wave before the two of them disappeared through a pillar of light, a brief flash illuminating the black starscape above. With Sid and Luca having gone on ahead into a different portal, that left only Yang to hold down the fort, at least, that had been the original plan, until he had picked up on the admittedly subtle clues that he had become the focus of somebody's tale. He had purposely waited until everyone was gone to initiate a confrontation. If it was the enemy, he wanted Ursula and the others out of harm's way. The chamber they had warped to from the Feymarch had reminded Yang of a dilapidated, long-neglected version of the Tower of Babel. The glass walls that normally would be illuminated with hundreds of pulsing blue lights were blackened with dust and soot, like a fire had ignited inside and burned every circuit to a crisp. The floors were riddled with gouges, scratches, and gaping potholes, and in the case of the potholes, there seemed to be no limit to their depth. Yang could only see continual darkness when he peered into each one that matched the heavens above. The ceiling of the twisting chamber, if there had ever been one, was completely removed, blanketing them in the velvet black of space. He had no way of knowing for sure, but Yang had a feeling that a terrible battle had once taken place here. Were it not so dark, he had the suspicion he would also be able to make out blood spill in the crevices of the sullied glass. There was also the heavy-hearted malaise that accompanied the aura of the chamber that he simply could not shake off. The caustic scent of war and strife soaked the air, shook him to his core every time he took a breath. Also, like the Tower of Babel, the chamber quickly splintered into multiple trailing hallways, the exploration of a few revealing yet more portals situated at dead ends that were similar to the one Leviathan had opened for them in the Feymarch. It had been Rydia's idea to split up to cover more ground. Yang did not like it, but he was in the minority. Everyone else seemed to appreciate the possibility of getting out of such a creepy place faster by working together and had started discussing how they should make their approach before he could interject with an objection. And that had been when he had sensed the presence of another outside their party of 5, and had hurriedly volunteered to be the one to remain behind and finish exploring the chamber they were in now. If he could distract the enemy long enough for the others to escape, he would consider that a middling success. Turning a corner, Yang casually pressed himself against one of the filth-caked walls, pretending he was taking a breather. As he did so, he swore he saw the slight jump of a shadow only a few feet behind him, and turned away, not wanting it to seem like he had a clue anyone was there. Closing his eyes, he tried to quiet his mind, like he would do when he meditated, focusing only on the movement of air flowing in and out of his lungs as he drilled in on the little disturbances that tore through the otherwise still air like bullets shot from a gun. Slowly, a vision took form in his mind of the uninvited guest, and Yang's eyes suddenly snapped open, his head tilting toward the emptiness above as he spoke with a bemused warmth. "Edge, is it?" "Ha! Typical Yang." The shadow he had spied around the corner suddenly dropped a few feet away from him, sweeping into a mock bow. Edge then stood up, throwing behind him a magnificent scarlet cloak that Yang had not remembered him leaving the ship with. Nevertheless, Yang admired the way it fell from Edge's slender shoulders like a waterfall of flame. He wasn't much for fashion, but it definitely seemed like a piece that was created solely to be worn by a monarch who courted chaos as frequently as he did pretty women. Edge tilted his head, grinning. "Pondering something?" It did not take much effort for Yang to resist grinning back. Happy as he was to see that Edge was alive, he was still very much aware of the potential terror that awaited them and was already starting to worry about Ursula. "There is much on my mind, yes. We still have yet to find a way to stop the moon's inexorable advance. And what's more, Cecil's not showing signs of improvement either," Edge interrupted, and Yang nodded. "Ursula spoke with Theodore and confirmed as much. He's here, somewhere, with Rosa, Kane and Golbez, who is apparently acting as Cecil's guardian." "That's smart," Edge said dryly, but Yang did not engage with his sarcasm. As troubling as he had found Ursula's report as well, he could not let himself immediately jump to the most negative conclusion possible. To do so would write off any hope he had of Cecil recovering. "But I still believe in him," Yang said softly. "I know Cecil will find himself again." "Yeah," Edge replied. "I'm sure everyone here would agree with that. They're all here, aren't they? I had a suspicion when I spotted you wandering about that the lunar whale may be empty now." "Well, it's kind of your fault," Yang raised an eyebrow. "When you never came back, people got worried." "People did?" Edge smirked. "Anyone in particular?" "No," Yang said quickly, and Edge's face fell. Yang crossed his arms and turned away, trying to hide a burgeoning smile in the shadows. It had been a while since he had spent any quality time with Edge, but it had seemed that not much had really changed in terms of Edge's fixation on a certain summoner. Yang wasn't sure if that was terribly romantic, or terribly pathetic, after all this time.
Is anyone else with you? My guard, or whatever you prefer to call them, sort of disobeyed my orders and stowed away on the ship.
Edge shrugged.
But it's all good, we've come to a compromise. Wave hi, guys. Hello, King Yang.
Sukainawa's voice exclaimed from a darkened corner, and the normally unflappable Yang jumped in surprise, hesitatingly raising a hand in reply even though he couldn't actually see the boy. I must be getting rusty if I could not sense all 5 of them. Goodness.
I have to admit, I had a similar idea about asking Ursula to stay behind, although I'm not foolish enough to believe that she would have gone for it. I'm fearful for Theodore too. Although it would seem he has grown to be a fine young man, hasn't he? Cecil would be proud if he could see him now. Yeah, he's grown up quite a bit,
Edge smiled.
Your daughter's nothing to sniff at either. Oh, not just yet,
Yang flushed.
There is still a great deal of training ahead for her. She has only just been accepted as my student. She has a long road to travel.
Edge shrugged, he didn't speak the language of humility.
Bah. With her leading the way, I'd say Fabul's going to be prosperous for many years to come. Perhaps.
Yang shook his head, sighing.
But now is not the time to worry about Fabul. We must find a way to save the whole world. True, true. Can't say I've quite figured out how to do that yet, though.
Yang stared down at the ground, weighing his next words carefully as to not come off as disrespectful.
Edge. I may sound like a hypocrite for asking this. But what do you intend to do with your own kingdom? You are the Lord of Evelyn. It would be a disaster if you passed away without an heir.
Edge forced a laugh that echoed maddeningly in the empty corridor, wagging his finger.
Hold it right there. You're starting to sound a little too much like Seneschal for my liking. Sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not old enough to be thinking about the pitter-patter of little feet yet.
Yang frowned. He realized he was more advanced in age than Edge, but not he was that much older, and the two of them had become the rulers of their respective kingdoms at nearly the same time.
You don't think so? No subject could be completely happy with a king who does not think of the future, and even you won't be around for forever, my friend. What do you spend your days thinking about, if not fortifying the future of Evelyn?
Edge laughed again, much quieter this time. Yang's words had sunk into him like a punch to the gut, and he wasn't sure if he could utter the painful truth of it all out loud. I used to think about it every day, until I no longer had a reason to. You don't dream of a future when you live in the past, something I'm trying to remedy now. But will I even have a future after this is all over? Is the fact that I can't picture it means that I'm doomed to never come home? But instead of pouring his guts out, he merely shrugged.
Maybe you have a point.
But Yang could see the despair that had manifested in Edge's stony eyes, and suddenly felt terrible for even bringing any of it up. As a fellow monarch, he had been curious about what Edge might say, knowing they had left their kingdoms in similar straits, but he had let himself be fooled by the ninja's devil-may-care persona into thinking that like most anything else, Edge wouldn't have taken the inquiry seriously, not like Cecil or Edward might have. I suppose that even our Edge has grown up, too. How easy it is for me to forget that war can change a man in the most subtle of ways, even just below the surface. Shifting uncomfortably against the wall, Yang turned back to Edge, his face softening. He noticed now that Edge was turning a small vial over and over in his fingers, a sheen of opalescence streaked over the glass as the powder within gently shifted up and down with each flick of Edge's hand. Yang welcomed the change of subject and nodded toward the vial.
What's that you have there? This.
Edge tossed the vial in the air and extended his hand to catch it.
A little present I got from his Aoi. Eblanessa smelling salts. Sid.
Luca's voice quivered as she spied her mentor slumped against a wall, his head tucked to his chin and his eyes clenched shut beneath his goggles. Although she hadn't been gone long, it had been a blaring crash that had made her rush back from the chamber she had been exploring. Panic rose in her throat as she slowly approached Sid from the perimeter of the hall, her eyes darting to the cloud of settling dust that was hanging in the air a few feet away over a pile of rubble. Her gaze slid upward, and she could see that part of the metallic ceiling had caved in. Steeling herself, She brushed her fingers over the handle of her tomahawk and made her approach. Suddenly, an upside-down head popped through the hole in the ceiling, causing Luca to nearly scream with fright. It was that little ninja boy from the Evelyn 4, Tsukinawa, a stupid grin on his face that reminded her so much of Edge that she wanted to simultaneously slap him and kiss him. Ugh, maybe I do have bad taste in men. But why are the naughtiest ones always the most charming?
Tsuki!
Luca gasped.
What are you doing here? Tsuki!
He chortled.
That's too cute a nickname for one of the most elite ninjas of the realm.
He totally glossed over the trifling detail that he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this place. Luca had heard Edge telling off the Evelyn 4 on the bridge of the Lunar Whale before forcing them to get off.
It means moon, right?
Luca shrugged.
Seems appropriate, given where we are. Those in my inner circle call me Lapin,
Tsukinawa offered.
It means rabbit. How is that not cute?
Luca exclaimed, and suddenly a snort ripped through the room, reminding her that now was not the time to flirt with adorable boys. She turned to Sid, who had rolled over on his side, his beard fluttering as his lips smacked.
Wait. He's just asleep. Yeah,
Tsukinawa said.
I've been watching him nap. Master Edge was chatting with King Yang and I was getting a little bored pretending not to eavesdrop, so I found a way to sneak into some ductwork in the ceiling. But it must be ancient, this is what happened when I stayed in one spot too long.
He nodded toward the rebel on the floor, and Luca frowned.
Ductwork? That would imply.
She shook her head, sighing. Her thoughts were racing a mile a minute.
Never mind. You said Edge is with Yang? And he knows you're here. Yeah, although the four of us got a solid telling off first,
Tsukinawa flushed.
Anyway, you're not going to find anything down here, I've combed this place up and down from above. Great,
Luca smirked, any urges to further investigate already dissipating anyway thanks to the fireworks she was anticipating would explode when Rydia and Edge were in the same room once again.
Let me just wake the old man up and I'll be right behind you. I'll see you soon,
Tsukinawa winked, disappearing back into the darkness as silently as he had arrived. Luca kneeled down next to Sid and gave him a rough shake.
Master Sid.
Another snort jolted out of Sid's nose, and his eyes snapped open.
Whwa? Hey? We under attack. It's me, Master.
Luca rolled her eyes, glancing at the collapsed ceiling. How had he possibly slept through that racket?
If we were under attack, you would never know it. Oh. Oh. Luca.
Sid laughed.
Don't sneak up on me like that. You'll give a guy a heart attack.
Luca pressed her lips together.
I'm impressed you can sleep so soundly in a place like this. You don't think it's creepy? You kidding me? I've slept in far worse, the barren dungeons, for starters. I have to rest up while I can, you know. We've got some serious work to do. Haha.
Luca giggled.
Wise words from your decades of battlefield experience, I suppose. You got that right. Hey. What do you mean, decades?
Luca shook her head.
Anyway, Master. I was thinking about this enemy we face. These girls. And anyone else that might be supporting them. Do you think we have what it takes to defeat them? I mean, look at this moon.
Sid idly tapped his fingers on his robust belly.
What do you mean?
Luca stood up, crossing her arms as she took another long look around the room.
Doesn't it strike you that this moon almost seems like it was created by somebody? It's almost like a gigantic craft, of sorts. The smell of metal is everywhere, and we were being forced to see illusions by what I can only surmise is a combination of technology and magic, and the technology part was already starting to break down near the end of our journey in the Feymarch. There's ductwork in the ceilings as well, which would mean air is being purposely circulated in and out of this place.
The smile drained from Sid's face, and he nodded, sliding his goggles up to his forehead.
Glad to see you noticed, I was wondering when you might say something. But I would have expected no less from you.
Luca's cheeks burned slightly at the compliment, but there were still more worries plaguing her mind.
Perhaps Cecil and the others can deal with this foe? But can I? Can either of us, for that matter?
She shook her head.
We're just a pair of engineers following the people we love. When Rydia was in danger, I felt as if there was nothing I could do. In the end, I could only watch her suffer.
Sid stood up, gently resting his hand on Luca's shoulder.
You couldn't have it more wrong. You need to believe in yourself, Luca, believe in yourself the same way you do when you're building a ship or programming your dolls. This is your generation's time now, you realize. Master. Your knowledge and skill go way beyond anything I could ever achieve, Luca. You know, Cecil and his lot have been a great aid to us all, but then I see you. And Theodore. And even little Mid. At your age, you three still have infinite potential waiting ahead for you. A woman like you is going to change the world someday, and I'm not even just talking about what you're doing here right now. I want to be around to see that, so that's why I'm here, supporting you, and Theodore, and everyone else. I can't do something as amazing as summon Eidolons. Hell, I don't even have a single drop of magical blood in my body. But if even just my being here helps Cecil realize that he has friends waiting for him to wake up, then that's good enough for me. I know Rydia is grateful you are here too, you put her heart at ease and help her remember what it is she is fighting for when her light is at its dimmest.
Luca blushed deeper, pressing her hand to her mouth as she nodded.
Why yes, sir.
Sid gave her a toothy grin, wagging his finger.
But don't let all of that go to your head. If you think I'm going to retire to some country cottage with an apprentice like you running around, forget it. I've still got the burden of making sure you focus all that potential properly, you are still just a kid, after all. A kid?
Luca shoved Sid away, half smiling.
Maybe compared to a stubborn old man like you. If I weren't around, would you even know how to work on new technology like Kalka and Brina? You should be grateful I can teach you more refined engineering techniques that don't involve bashing things with a hammer.
Sid shoved her back, snorting.
Since when did I say you could tell me how to work on machinery? Luca.
Another shove, this one slightly less gentle.
Well, I've been doing it for a while now if you haven't noticed.
Sid snapped his goggles back over his eyes, gritting his teeth.
Pa. I hope you're ready to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to your engineer's exam. What?
Luca blinked, lowering her raised palms.
What do you mean? I mean, if you're giving me so much sass, then it must mean you're ready to prove yourself, right?
Sid smirked.
So as soon as we get home, you would best be ready to take it. You didn't think I'd just hand you a license, right? And no.
Luca gasped, a happy laugh leaping out of her throat.
You never mentioned me being ready before. Maybe I've made you wait long enough,
Sid shrugged.
Or maybe not. Will you be there? Yes, of course.
Luca cried.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
A stifling grip took hold of Edward's blade, the bard's eyes widening with horror as he felt the knife get effortlessly ripped from his hand and watched it clatter to the floor, the blade warped and bent beyond recognition. He felt the hot rush of his assailant's breath smack him in the face as his hand was shoved away, a familiar growl vibrating in the air.
I've really had quite enough of being stabbed today, I hope you understand.
A flash of violet cut through the darkness, and a gentle glow suddenly washed over them, revealing a familiar gleam of silver hair plastered against a sash of black.
Golbez.
Edward choked, and he felt Harley jump behind him, her voice squeaking.
And Prince Theodore. Harley. Edward.
Another familiar voice called out, and Edward saw Rose's head pop up behind Golbez's shoulder. Theodore circled around Harley to face the two of them, his sword cast aloft revealed to be the source of the light, the crystalline blade was pulsing with threads of holy magic, shards of glittering adamantite reflecting in the prince's eyes.
You're all okay.
Edward sighed happily, collapsing against the pillar and shaking his head.
I'm so sorry. For a moment, I thought you were the enemy.
He eyed his now destroyed knife and glanced up at Golbez warily.
Wait. What did you mean by your comment before? It's irrelevant now,
Golbez glowered.
Just don't let it happen again. Certainly,
Edward muttered. Harley spun around to face Theodore, who smiled at her shyly. He was starting to get used to Golbez's blunt brand of discourse, and part of him even thought it was a little funny, but something about being around Harley always made him want to stand up straighter, make sure his hair was combed properly, and slap a serious look on his face. He idly wondered if she and Captain Biggs would have gotten on well.
Where is Kane?
Harley asked.
Did he stay behind on the lunar whale with Cecil? I'm right here,
Kane's voice rang out, and there came another set of footsteps banging down the stairs. Theodore pointed his sword toward the sound, revealing Kane's statuesque form, approaching them like a swan gliding through water. And walking beside him, his eyes luminous and his face glowing with color.
Cecil!
Edward cried, and Cecil broke into a smile, raising a hand as his gaze briefly flickered.
Wonderful to see you again, Edward and Harley. I apologize that our last meeting was not as pleasant. Although I guess you can't really say the same for this one, either. No, this is still preferable,
Edward laughed, grabbing hold of Cecil's hand and pulling him into a one-armed hug. Cecil beat his fist against Edward's back, and Harley folded her hands together, tilting her head.
You have memories of our time together, King Cecil. Fragmented, but yes,
Cecil replied, pulling away from Edward and shaking his head.
Enough to know that I didn't treat either of you with the respect you deserved, for which I don't even know how to begin to apologize. And despite my cruelty, you still came to my rescue. Theodore has told me everything that happened in Damsion when he found you, Edward. There is no need for apologies,
Harley said, her small smile all the assurance Cecil needed that she was speaking beyond diplomatics.
It's a relief to see that you are restored back to your natural self. And what luck it was to find you two!
Rosa exclaimed.
Are the twins and Leonora somewhere nearby? You five came here together, right?
Harley and Edward took turns explaining what had happened to them in the duration of their journey, including the moment they were separated from the mages and the ensuing battle with Barbarici afterward.
The last we heard, they were on Mount Ordeals, or at least, a replica of such,
Edward said.
We've heard nothing from them since. A replica?
Kane crossed his arms.
Does that mean that none of the places we visited were real, either? I suspected as much when we were in the lunar core,
Golbez frowned.
I could feel none of the spirits of the sleeping Lunarians during my walkabout, none of them answered my prayers, either. At first, I thought it was because they were closing themselves off to my voice, but... No, it wasn't just you,
Theodore said quickly.
I was trying to speak with them too, and failed. But this chamber feels different,
Cecil shook his head.
None of us have ever been in a place like this before, right? And there have been no more crystals or revived enemies. Perhaps we have reached the true core of this moon,
Harley surmised.
And our enemy has no more illusions left to show us. The mysterious girl seemed surprised that we made it this far. If we've been transported here, then surely the others will be close behind.
Rosa said.
We should stick together and keep moving. I second that,
Edward nodded.
The larger our party, the harder it will be for our enemy to get the drop on us.
Theodore took point with his makeshift torch as they began to make their way south, Cecil and Rosa slipping behind him. Harley and Edward sandwiched themselves in the middle of their troop, by doing so both silently admitting that they would not be the best options to protect the rear in the event of a surprise attack. Kane and Golbez strayed a few feet behind, awkwardly avoiding each other's gazes as their footsteps echoed exasperatingly in the otherwise abandoned chamber. After a few minutes of agonizing silence, not even Harley and Edward were in the mood to talk to each other. Kane glanced at Golbez again. This time, out of the corner of his eye, he spied Golbez glaring at him, or that might have just been his normal resting stare, he had no way of knowing for sure. He slowed his stride just enough so that he fell another few paces behind and noticed that Golbez automatically adjusted to match him. What the hell? Is he trying to make sure I'm not the one watching him? Kane felt the hair rise on the back of his neck as he fell back into step with Golbez, letting Edward and Harley stroll just out of earshot before muttering under his breath. If Golbez wanted to bait him, then he figured he may as well give the man a piece of his mind.
Never in a million years did I expect you to come back. When you burst into the throne room at the castle, I thought I was seeing a ghost.
And then, much to Kane's surprise, Golbez bowed his head and quietly laughed. Well, it was more like a series of quick grunts than full-on laughter, but Kane knew it was the closest he would ever get to seeing Golbez emote anything other than simmering rage or dysphoria. He was expecting at best, silence, and at worst, a one-way trip over the ledge of the path, so this was fairly promising.
It has been a while, hasn't it, Kane?
Kane raised an eyebrow. Indeed it has.
I have somewhat mixed feelings about this reunion. But I must admit, you have been a strong ally for all of us, especially Cecil and Theodore. If you weren't here, I fear those two would be lost many times over.
Golbez crossed his arms over his chest, lightly tapping a finger against his bicep as he gave Kane a once-over.
You seem to have changed, too, from last we met. Am I correct in my assumption that it's only been recently you've returned to the Baronian nest?
Cain sucked a gulp of air between his teeth as he stared down at the glimmering emerald of his boots.
It took a very long time. But I have regained control of myself. Just as Cecil did. And just as you did as well, I suppose. As much as I wanted to blame everyone else around me for everything that happened during the war, including you, in the end, I realized the only one to blame was myself. Perhaps some things happened to me that were beyond my control, but what I did have control over was how I dealt with it all after the fact. That is to say, I didn't. So, what happened? I set aside my pride and gave all of my heart to the one whose love I both craved and rejected for these last 17 years. I decided that if my life was to be forfeit to keep him safe from my darkness, that it was the smallest price I could possibly pay. My transformation. I owe it all the power of the Lunarians. In particular, the power of you and Cecil's father. I see.
Golbez nodded, and Cain inwardly winced. He suddenly wondered if it hurt Golbez at all to hear Cain talk about the way their father had saved his life, how Cluya had blessed both him and Cecil with a moonlit oath that Golbez had never gotten to experience as his firstborn son. A crooked smile formed on Golbez's lips, and Cain noticed for the first time that his mouth was identical to Cecil's, down to the slightly elongated right canine that brushed his pale lower lip and the brittle hold in the corner of his mouth that had always clued Cain in as to when Cecil was faking his happiness. That had been his tell since they were children that something was terribly wrong, and it seemed he had yet to grow out of it. Cain had noticed the precarious, fragile smile Cecil forced on his face when he saw Edward and Harley.
Is it reasonable for me to conclude that Cecil is the only reason why you haven't yet dealt me punishment for destroying your life?
Cain met Golbez's gaze head-on, his ponytail falling over the curve of his shoulder as he paused. Golbez pivoted to face him.
I don't want to be the one that makes Cecil look the way he did in the lunar core when he thought you were dead,
Cain said coolly.
Never again. So yeah. If that's what you want to believe to help you sleep at night, have at it.
Golbez chuckled, shaking his head.
I haven't slept in 17 years, you realize.
Cain turned away, his heart hammering so intensely against his chest that he thought for sure he was about to pass out. Me neither. He had to mentally coach himself to put one foot in front of the other to begin walking again before the others noticed he and Golbez had fallen behind.
Is this moon related to yours at all?
Golbez pressed his lips into a thin line, saying nothing as his footsteps fell in line with Cain's once more. Cain tried again, wondering if his attempt at changing the subject was really that transparent.
What has happened to your moon in the ensuing years? I do not know.
Golbez looked away, and Cain came to another halt, his heart leaping into his throat.
The lunar crystals. They were truly destroyed.
After a few beats, Golbez ceased walking as well, his back still to Cain.
The Lunarians' crystals were robbed of their power. The enemy's claws were upon them by the time I had awoken from stasis. It would seem Fusoya knew a bit more than he was willing to share with me, but either way, the result was the same. Just as they did here, the shattered crystals on the Red Moon revealed to us a horrid enemy from the past, with nothing left to seal away Zamu's hatred. Zeramus was revived in the lunar core. When I feared I was to draw my last breath, Fusoya used the last of his power to teleport me to the lunar whale, and it had already been set on a course for the blue planet that I could not reverse.
Cain drew in a sharp breath.
So, both Fusoya and the Red Moon.
Golbez unleashed a menacing growl that sent a shiver down Cain's spine.
Whoever controls this moon, I am going to exact my revenge upon them. It's true that I returned for Cecil, even if it appeared to be unwillingly. I know Fusoya would not have made the decision he did unless he could see within my heart. But knowing everything I do now, I cannot allow this mockery to continue for a moment longer. The sleeping Lunarians didn't deserve to be obliterated for having the audacity to dream of a second chance at life. And Fusoya, he.
Golbez shook his head, exhaling shakily.
He sent me because he knew it would come to this. He had the premonition of what would come to be. He knows that the role I play best is destroyer of worlds.
When Cain looked away, he was shocked to see that the others had stopped walking ahead of them as well. But none of them were paying any attention to he or Golbez. The discovery of a new portal was the blessed distraction.
The path ends here,
Theodore announced, hesitantly sheathing his blade and cutting off their light supply.
And so we shall proceed,
Golbez murmured, dying motes of starlight drowning in his gaze.
What is this place?
Rydia whispered, her breath puffing out in little white clouds from the sudden plunge in temperature.
It's beautiful, reminds me of a garden, frozen in time. We may have gone too far,
Ursula muttered, not believing the cowardly words that were coming out of her mouth. But the truth was, she was now utterly terrified. Unlike Rydia, she felt there was something about the sterility of this new place that reminded her of an abandoned hospital, a place someone would come to be healed, but all of the white mages had fled the premises, turning it instead into an arid graveyard where people simply came to die. This new location to which they had been spirited away when they had left Yang was totally different. They had broken free of the tower and were now on a plain of crystal, surrounded by piercing white that reflected the waltzing stars above and made Ursula feel as if she were trapped inside a jewelry box. Curling crystalline plants that resembled the spiral of a snail's shell were blossoming at towering heights all around them, and clusters of diamond and sapphire shards were bursting out of the ground at their feet like clusters of wildflowers in a meadow. With each step forward, their footfalls rang out like someone playing scales on a piano. In the short distance ahead, an archway of snowy white crystal awaited, labyrinthine carvings snaking beneath each face like ribbons dancing in the wind, forever frozen in time. What lay beyond was a portal of swirling space dust and starlight, bigger than any gateway they had yet to come across. A glass bridge that looked as if it would shatter if anyone actually walked upon it extended parallel from the gate on each side, extending to a floating island each overgrown with yet more crystal.
Let's bring the others back here,
Rydia said.
I don't want to go much further without them. It looks as if that giant portal is our ticket out of here. Good idea,
Ursula said, letting out a sigh of relief as she wrapped her arms around herself and began to rub furiously.
Maybe I can borrow someone's cloak. Why do you think the temperature dropped so drastically? I haven't the foggiest.
Rydia shook her head.
I haven't understood the purpose of any of these chambers thus far.
As they turned to leave, a thunderous crash burst near the archway, sending a puff of crystal shards flying in the air as a pile of wriggling limbs crashed onto the island to the left. Rydia and Ursula froze, their hearts pounding a mile a minute as a high-pitched shriek pierced the sky.
I think one of those crystals went right up my... Oh my gods, that's Palom.
Rydia gasped, and Ursula clapped her hands together, eyes wide.
And Porum and Leonora, too. Ugh.
Porum groaned, sandwiched between Palom and Leonora with a crick in her neck the size of the Enterprise.
Leonora, do you think you can get off of me? I am trying, Lady Porum.
Leonora squealed.
Ack.
She suddenly tumbled backward, rolling off the ledge of the island and managing to grasp onto a crystal before she plunged into the depths below.
Oh. Dear. Leonora.
Porum gasped, rolling onto her stomach and outstretching her hand.
Hold on. Float.
Leonora sighed in relief as a pair of angel wings formed on her back, lifting her effortlessly into the air as she glided over the twins toward the bridge, where Rydia was jumping and calling to them. Leonora waved back excitedly, jumping up and down in midair.
It's Lady Rydia. And Ursula too. You. What of you?
Palom grinned, giving Porum a rough shove off of him so that he could roll onto his back and admire Leonora flouncing up and down, her silken robes fluttering in the air. Porum grunted, gifting him a sharp kick in the shin that made him howl in pain and cost Leonora to halt her impromptu peep show when she spun around to see what happened. After the mages had situated themselves and crossed the glass bridge to the main stretch of the garden, Rydia greeted each of them with a hug, except Palom, whom she only offered a condescending smile as a show of solidarity with Luca. He gave her a wicked grin in return, as always letting any bad vibes roll off his back.
Was anyone else with you?
Ursula asked, and Leonora shook her head.
I'm afraid not, just us three. We were with Harley and Edward but were separated quite some time ago. What of Yang, Luca, and Sid? We split up to explore, but we were just about to find everyone and bring them here,
Rydia explained.
Wait here for us, and we'll be right back.
A burst of static abruptly exploded from Porum's chest, drawing all eyes to her as she blushed deeply and proceeded to shield herself with her arm while she fumbled around the clasp of her cloak, withdrawing the sprig of whisperweed from where it had been tucked in her top.
Hello.
Leonora shouted into Porum's breast, and Porum gently yanked Leonora's ponytail so that the girl was directing her voice toward the plant instead. There were a few beats of crackling air, and then suddenly Edward's voice came through, clear as a sunny day.
Leonora? Is that you? Are you okay? We're all fine,
Leonora said cheerfully.
In fact, we're better than fine, we've just run into Rydia and Ursula. You speak truly.
Edward gasped, and Rydia couldn't help but beam at the sound of his voice.
As luck would have it, I've found some familiar faces as well. We were just about to step into another portal when the whisperweed suddenly went crazy. We must be at least close enough to each other if the whisperweed works again,
Porum mused aloud, her gaze drifting over to the tiny island to the right.
I wonder.
Leonora followed Porum's stare.
Perhaps you should try entering the portal one at a time. I suppose you have a reason for such a request?
Edward asked, and Leonora nodded, forgetting that he couldn't actually see her.
Yeah. Just give it a try,
Porum added quickly.
Contact us again when you've made it to the other side.
A few seconds later, the line went dead.
I'll go and get Yang and the others,
Rydia offered hurriedly as she spun back around toward the entryway.
I'll be back as soon as humanly possible. Don't worry. We already took care of that.
Rydia screamed in surprise when two shadows materialized before her, clasping her hand to her chest when she realized they were only Izayoi and Zangetsu. Izayoi giggled at Rydia's fright, smacking her ruby lips.
You really didn't notice we were following you this entire time? No.
Rydia protested, and Ursula rested her hand on her hip, shaking her head.
Sorry to surprise you,
Zangetsu smiled gently. Unlike Izayoi, he had not seemed to enjoy scaring Rydia as much.
King Yang and our master were just getting a touch worried about everyone. Your master? You mean Edge?
Rydia blinked.
You've seen Edge? Only a few moments ago when we went to fetch your comrades,
Izayoi said.
Master Edge, King Yang, Princess Luca, Sid, Gekao, and Tsukinawa, they were waiting for you.
She giggled.
Some more impatiently than others. Damn,
Rydia muttered, even as her stomach suddenly blossomed with a million butterflies at the thought of Edge being so near. Edge is alive. But I still don't know if I want to kiss him or kill him for putting us through this wild goose chase. Another crash of thunder rolled across the chamber, a light-limbed figure materializing from the sky and collapsing over the rightmost island as a whirlwind of disturbed crystal dust climbed into the air. Rydia's voice caught in her throat as she made her approach, shielding her eyes as a sudden blast of Arctic air sent the dust flying in her face, whipping back her hair and cape. Even half-blinded, she caught the familiar glimpse of polished azure and pearl armor, and silver hair that cascaded in the wind like silken ribbons.
Rydia.
Cecil slowly lifted himself onto his knees in the center of a bed of pulsing crystals, pushing his hair out of his eyes as he smiled tranquilly.
Is it really you this time? This time.
Rydia choked, shaking her head quickly. She had no idea what he could possibly be talking about, but couldn't bring herself to waste precious seconds asking. Before she could comprehend what was happening, she found her legs carrying her across the length of the bridge, her arms pumping furiously as a stream of tears trailed down her cheeks. Cecil staggered to his feet, extending his arms toward her, when a sweep of shadow suddenly plummeted between them, and Edge materialized in a plume of smoke, laughing bodily as he threw his arms around Cecil's neck.
Long time no see, buddy.
Edge exclaimed, and Rydia slid to a halt, her eyes two pits of flame as Cecil's arms apologetically wrapped around Edge, the paladin patting his back awkwardly as he shot Rydia a look that screamed, "Help me!"
Hey Edge. You're as energetic as ever,
Cecil stammered, and Edge pulled back, grinning as he looked Cecil up and down.
It's about time you got here. We've been waiting for you, you know, can't get this show on the road without the star. Oh, please.
Rydia shrieked.
If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. You just had to run off, didn't you? Thought big, bad Edge was going to save the world all on his own? What the hell were you thinking? Oh my gods, I'm having déjà vu,
Cecil murmured, pressing his fingers to his temple to check for any obvious signs of a wound.
Did I just fall into another coma? Oh ho ho,
Edge snorted, spinning toward Rydia and crossing his arms defiantly.
And like a petulant child, you just couldn't stay put on the ship, hey? I told you I'd be right back. When are you going to understand that I'm just trying to protect you? Edge,
Cecil warned, his eyes wide.
Do not say the C word. Hey.
Edge blinked, but he had already sealed his fate. Rydia released an ear-shattering scream and dove on top of him, slamming him to the ground as she reached back for her whip.
Should we stop them?
Leonora gasped, and Palom shook his head.
She can control Eidolons, and he's a weasel. Best to just let natural selection take its course at this point.
The portal above the brawling duo began to glow again, and Cecil managed to sidestep away just in time for another person to fall through. This time it was Rosa, whom he caught readily. She peered down at Rydia and Edge from over Cecil's shoulder, the latter of which had managed to raise his arms enough to shield his face as Rydia fumbled to get her weapon detached from her belt. Rosa giggled behind her hand.
Oh my goodness, it's just like old times. You guys better get out of there,
Ursula bellowed.
Or the next person that comes through is going to knock you over like a bunch of pins.
Cecil set Rosa down, proceeding to drag both Rydia and Edge down the bridge as more of their party made their way through the portal. Edward, Harley, Theodore, Kane, and finally Golbez. Meanwhile, Yang and the others had caught up to Edge, who was hiding behind Cecil as Rosa and Edward struggled to hold Rydia back. She was now foaming at the mouth.
What is going on here?
Yang laughed, and Ursula and Porum proceeded to throw themselves at Cecil, each grabbing one of his arms and clinging for dear life. Cecil blushed as he tried to keep up with their rapid-fire greetings and questions, his head spinning as he turned back and forth between each girl whenever she spoke. Sid and Luca bounded over next, Sid's ruddy face already racked with tears, and Palom, who was standing off to the side with his arms crossed and a look of boredom slashed across his face, finally gave up his too cool act when he caught Leonora's encouraging smile from the corner of his eye. Out of everyone in the room, she was the only one who didn't have her eyes trained on the newly revived Cecil.
Go on,
she whispered.
You were so worried about him. Right.
Palom shrugged, his eyes twinkling as he took a few steps forward.
I wouldn't want him to think I missed him too badly.
Amid the swell of chatter and the random questions being slung at the newcomers, but mostly Cecil, Theodore shrunk back between Kane and Golbez, his stomach twisting queerly as the chorus of the excited voices shattering the still atmosphere melted into a blur that made his brain throb with every shout. Beneath it all, a harried whisper echoed in his skull with each beat of his heart, so loud and close now that he could practically feel the mouth against his ear. Darkness. Light. In the end, none of it matters. I will save you from this agony. That which comes from each breath leading you closer still to death.
Ugh.
Theodore groaned to himself, pressing his hand to his forehead and wincing at the clash of his freezing fingers against his burning skin.
That voice again.
Kane and Golbez both glanced down at Theodore, watching as he pushed his fingers through his hair and clenched his jaw.
What's wrong?
Kane asked, and Theodore shook his head slowly, mumbling something incomprehensible under his breath. Golbez cringed when he saw the light in Theodore's eyes briefly flicker to obsidian, staining his gaze the same color as the depthless galaxy.
Get the boy someplace quiet,
Golbez said under his breath, and Kane looked up at Golbez, noting the concerned lines that were tracing his narrowed eyes. He gently took Theodore by the arm, coaxing him toward the archway as he stumbled behind him.
Kane.
When they were safely out of earshot from the others, Kane pushed on Theodore's shoulder, gesturing for him to sit down. Theodore collapsed on the floor wordlessly, and Kane sat beside him, leaning in.
Doesn't having Cecil back make you happy at all?
It was as if someone had lit a torch behind Theodore's eyes. He suddenly sat up straight, blinking away the haze that had settled in his stare.
Oh, of course. I'm overjoyed. It's just that, well.
Kane continued to stare at him, unyielding, and Theodore squirmed, pressing his hands together as he looked back up toward the gathering crowd around his father. He spied Ursula's puffy pigtails, like two overgrown hydrangea bushes, bounce excitedly as she fluttered between her father and his. Golbez had slipped behind Rosa, who had finally managed to calm Rydia, and was whispering something in her ear.
Just that.
Kane's gaze followed Theodore's, and he shook his head.
Having a world leader as a father would be a heavy burden to bear for anyone. Hey.
Theodore paled. Damn. How can someone I barely know understand exactly what I am thinking? Kane pressed his fingers to his lips as he watched Cecil spin around toward a shyly smirking Palom, poking him with the end of his rod and quickly retracting it before Cecil could see.
My father was a dragoon himself. The Dragoons of Baron once formed the most prestigious of all armed divisions. Until the Red Wings were formed, that is. I idolized the Dragoons since childhood. But I hated my strict and unrelenting father.
Theodore bit his lower lip as Kane stared at his reflection in the floor, a sad smile lifting the corners of his pale mouth. Kane. You told me once that you knew it was hard to grow up in someone's shadow. But I had no idea that you understood firsthand.
Do you hate Cecil, Theodore?
Kane asked softly, and Theodore gasped, quickly shaking his head.
And no. Sometimes I get confused and scared about what it means, being his son. But I love him. That's why I wanted to come here. I love him, and I'm not ready to be without him. I don't know if I ever will be, to be honest.
Kane nodded.
Good. That means you two will come to understand, eventually. You don't have to have all the answers now. I know you'll find your way, not because you're Cecil's son, but because you're Theodore Harvey.
Theodore felt a spasm hiccup in his chest as tears sprung to his eyes.
What happened to your father, Kane? In Mist Cave, you told me your family was gone before the war had broken out. He died,
Kane said softly.
When I was a little younger than you. There were whispers of an assassination attempt. I never learned the truth, and the men who might have known are long gone along with him. I'm sorry,
Theodore whispered, and Kane shook his head.
I made my peace with it all long ago. What's important now is that we have to stop this moon. Yes.
Theodore scrambled to his feet, eyes wide.
Thanks. I hope you know I appreciate everything you've done for me. And for my parents. You don't have to thank me,
Kane said, standing up alongside him.
But if anything is wrong, you have to say something, don't just keep it buried inside, okay? Right?
Theodore nodded.
Sorry. I think I was just overwhelmed before. It's been a while since we've actually had something good happen to us. And then I remembered a creepy dream I had on the lunar whale. It's like my brain can't let me be happy for even a moment. You should talk to your father or Golbez about that,
Kane frowned.
You Lunarians are prone to premonitions, and I don't like the timing of a dream like that.
Theodore nodded nervously, plastering a fake smile on his face.
Right. I'll bring it up straight away.
But the truth was, he was terrified at what either man might have to say. If it was a premonition, wouldn't they have had the same dream and brought it up by now? What did it mean if only he could hear the voice? A few yards away, Rosa was quietly watching Kane and Theodore as they talked. Golbez had told her that Theodore didn't seem to be well, but from what she could see, he was perhaps just suffering from a case of nerves. She watched with a small smile as Theodore wrapped his arms around Kane, returning the hug and patting the boy a few times on the back before they broke apart. Thank you, Kane. Rosa thought, her heart soaring. Surely the gods would not bring a blessing like you back into our lives, only to tear us apart with the destruction of our world. I simply won't believe it. A low hush suddenly rolled over the chamber, causing Rosa, Kane, and Theodore to all turn toward the crowd that had been gathered around Cecil. Edward was fumbling with something in his vest. Moments later, he retrieved the bouquet of whisperweed, gesturing for everyone to quiet down when another hum of whispers started up.
Edward. Are you serious?
Cecil asked, and Edward nodded, holding the bouquet out from his chest.
Deadly serious. I know I heard it, just now. We're a great distance away from our home planet, you know?
Edge frowned.
King. Edward. Can you hear us?
A small voice crackled through the flowers, and Edward gasped, shooting Edge an
I told you so.
Face that made the ninja wither in surprise.
That voice.
Harley exclaimed.
There's no doubt about it,
Edward smiled, leaning in so he could speak into the flowers.
That's the Chancellor of Damcyan I hear. Your voice.
The Chancellor gasped.
Thank heavens. I finally can hear your voice. We thought you were lost to us. How are things going down there?
Edward asked.
Terrible. Simply terrible. We are enshrouded in deep darkness. The wind and waters are raging. Oh, no.
Rydia pressed her hands to her mouth, shaking her head.
To escalate so quickly.
Edge scooted in, butting past Palom and Porum as Edward tilted the bouquet toward his face.
This is Edge Geraldine. Have you heard anything from the other nations?
A blast of static exploded through the blooms, and Edge winced as the Chancellor's voice became choppy.
I fear we are no longer able to so much as set foot outside our own castle. All nations are effectively cut off from one another. What?
Edge hissed, and Cecil shook his head, crossing his arms.
We must work faster than ever if we have any hope of reversing some of this damage. That voice. Is that King Cecil?
The Chancellor questioned, and Edward nodded.
Yes. The one and only. He's regained his senses.
Both Harley and Edward winced at the diplomatic fail as Cecil took a deep breath and leaned in closer to the bouquet.
I apologize for all I have wrought. I couldn't have made it back without Harley and Edward's support. I know I'm being selfish for calling them away during this time of calamity, but I hope that you are someday able to forgive me. Cecil?
Edward began, but the Whisperweed burst to life again with excited glee.
Ah, no need for apologies at a time like this. This is fantastic news. If King Cecil is with you, the moon is as good as gone.
Cecil turned away, closing his eyes as Edward hurriedly took back the Whisperweed.
I'm sorry, but can you hold out just a little longer? We need you to stay strong, we're close, I can feel it. By all means, my lord. You have nothing to worry about with us. But, my lord, please take care of yourself. Damsien could hardly exist without your stout leadership. And I'm sure you understand that means Harley needs to come back in one piece, too. Harley has been the one taking care of us.
Edward smiled, and Harley rolled her eyes, turning away in a huff. She hated getting any kind of attention for simply doing her job.
I thank you. Be safe, everyone. Yes, my lord.
The line went dead, and Edward lowered the flowers, biting his lip.
I hope we can make it in time. We must.
Rydia whimpered.
No matter what happens. Things sound pretty bad down there,
Sid sighed.
Can't even imagine the shape Baron is in. I fear that it will only escalate quicker.
Edward frowned.
Think about this, why has the Whisperweed suddenly begun to work again? What?
Rydia blinked, and Cecil lifted his gaze.
Is it because the moon?
Edward nodded.
Indeed. It means this moon has come that close to reaching our homeland. No.
Rydia gulped, her knees buckling.
It feels like we've only been here for a short time.
Edge spun around to face her, taking her hand into his.
Then we just have to keep moving. With this crazy crew, nothing can possibly get in our way. It will be okay, I'll make sure of it.
To his surprise, she merely nodded, squeezing his hand as she blinked the tears out of her eyes.
Let's go.
Cecil cried, pointing toward the archway.
We'll take this portal and see where it leads.
The rush of pounding footsteps filled the crystal garden. Cain and Theodore, closest to the archway, were the first to step inside the portal, when a sudden flash of light exploded before them, sending them flying backwards into the crowd. Cecil managed to catch Theodore before he smashed into Harley, and Cain used the force to propel himself into a backflip, sliding backwards as he landed on bended knee. The starlight in the portal rippled like the rings of a pond, and the mysterious girl stepped outside to greet them, her feet levitating from the floor as she swept her gaze over the room.
Damn!
Cecil cursed under his breath, lowering Theodore to the floor and withdrawing his blade. Theodore scrambled to follow suit, still half-stunned from the blast as he blindly felt for his own weapon.
Well, look who decided to finally show up.
Edge laughed, sauntering to the front of the crowd.
Nice place you got here.
Is this just another copy? Golbez thought to himself, cracking his knuckles. Or is she the one who paid us a visit in the lunar core? The crack of a whip ignited in the air, and Rydia shoved past Cecil and Theodore, swiping away Edge's outstretched hand as she marched past him and got right in the mysterious girl's face.
I'm sure you know by now, but you were not able to force me to kill Azura and Leviathan. I've rescued them. And that leaves just one more Eidolon. Where is Bahamut?
The mysterious girl giggled, placing her palm on Rydia and promptly blasting her away with a stunning purple light. Rydia shrieked as she flew through the air like a ragdoll, Golbez diving forward just in time to grab her before she became impaled by a cluster of crystal statues. Rydia's head lolled backward in his arms, her eyes sliding shut. Porum rushed to them, crying out a race spell. Their uninvited guest clicked her tongue.
I had not anticipated that you would make it to this point. But the world that lies ahead has no place for you. It is time for you to disappear. Under the force of a power you know all too well.
She glared at Rydia, who was slowly climbing back into consciousness as Porum poured more healing magic into her.
You should feel lucky that I'm allowing you to say goodbye. Normally, I would find such a sentiment, well, incomprehensible.
A gruesome quake began to rock the chamber, sending a nebula of rainbow dust into the air as the crystals around them began to shiver and erupt in a chorus of tinkling glass, hairline fractures racing up their faces. A shadow-laced claw tore through the portal of the archway, swinging recklessly to the left and demolishing the supporting column. As the archway's keystone shuddered and broke loose from above, the rest of Bahamut made his way out of the portal, the keystone colliding with his skull with the same effect as a pebble bouncing off an ogre. With a snort, Bahamut shook his head, sending chunks of marble flying before slamming his tail into the remaining column and completing the archway's transformation into chalky rubble. The mysterious girl backed away silently, her eyes glowing with pleasure as Bahamut threw his wiry neck back and released a blaring roar that sent the chamber into another spasm.
Bahamut.
Rydia coughed, her eyes rolling in the back of her head as she struggled to catch her breath.
Please.
Cecil turned his gaze on the mysterious girl, glowering. Memories were pouring into him, unbidden, the way Bahamut's outstretched wing blocked the sun on the lookout of Barren Castle, drenching Cecil in darkness before the dragon's attack had nearly snuffed away his life, the thunderous destruction that had ripped through his throne room like a hurricane as he fell away, further and further, into himself, unable to even lift a finger in defense of his own kingdom.
I will not allow this to end as it did once before.
He twisted toward the dragon, his eyes pleading even as he lifted his blade in the direction of Bahamut's heart.
Bahamut. The one you've pledged yourself to stands here before you, open your eyes. Words will serve no purpose.
Golbez frowned.
Bahamut is under her complete control. I see you at least are capable of retaining some information.
The mysterious girl grinned.
Go Bahamut. Go forth and obliterate them.
And with that, she traced open a shining blue portal next to her with her fingertip, and dove within, disappearing from the battlefield. Bahamut snorted a trail of fire that stretched across the chamber from above, staining the heavens the color of raging blood. Rydia gingerly shoved Golbez away from her, sliding down from his arms and scrambling toward Cecil. She grabbed his arm, forcing his sword to the floor as she gazed up at Bahamut's deadened stare.
Bahamut. It's me. Please, you must remember.
With a billowing gust of wind that nearly knocked everyone in the front row off their feet, Bahamut lifted himself from the floor with his wings, whirling his body around to smash them with his tail. Cecil grabbed Rydia and Dove out of the way with seconds to spare, the two of them crashing into a tower of mist-colored quartz that shattered from the impact and rained upon them. Porum and Leonora executed twin protect spells, the tail-turned whip smashing into the golden shield that washed over the rest of the party.
Bahamut.
Rydia shrieked as she choked on crystal dust.
Don't do this. What are we supposed to do?
Cecil asked, pulling her into his chest as another cascade of quartz showered them from above.
How did you awaken the others? There's something that must be unlocked in the Eidolon's heart,
Rydia moaned.
And my heart. It's not always enough to make theirs stir.
Bahamut circled the chamber, screeching another warning cry as he blasted hellfire upon everyone below. A barrage of shell magic was released by the collective of white mages as a counter, temporarily filling the gardens with a halo of shimmering green light. Stymied, Bahamut drew his wings back defiantly, launching himself higher into the air and tilting his head back as a flood of boiling red and blue flame began to gurgle in his extended maw.
Mega Flare!
Edward cried.
We haven't much time.
A wave of panic rolled over the group, and Rosa stuck her fingers between her lips, discharging a sharp whistle and holding up her other hand so that she could get everyone's attention. The harried mumbling came to a halt, and she cupped her hands around her mouth so that her voice carried as far as possible.
Listen. The only way to escape Mega Flare is with Reflect magic. Who among us knows Reflect?
Rosa kept her hand up as her eyes swept over the crowd. She counted Porum, Leonora, and Theodore among the raised hands, and pressed her lips together.
Okay. Here's what we'll do. If each of us can cast for 5 targets simultaneously, then we can protect the entire party before Bahamut can attack. F5 targets.
Leonora blanched.
Queen Rosa. I apologize, but... isn't that impossible? Erg. I second Leonora's question.
Porum gulped. Theodore stared down at his feet, his pulse racing as he counted himself in as a silent third doubter. He knew his mother could multicast Reflect, he had witnessed as much during their first battle with Bahamut, but he also saw how it had wrecked her afterward, remembering how she had needed to use Cain as a crutch just to stand under her own power. Even if we manage to cast the spell, we'll be left vulnerable for the next blow.
It's not impossible,
Rosa said quickly, her assurances tripping over themselves as they tumbled out of her mouth. Above, the dragon's maw was starting to boil over with rolling smoke and liquid flame. It wouldn't be long now until his attack was fully charged.
You just need to concentrate as intensely as you can manage to get a perfect image of your targets. You must block everything else out and pour every drop of mana you have into the spell.
Porum bit her lip, and Palom gave her ponytail a violent tug.
Ouch. What the hell was that for at a time like this? Come on Porum,
Palom frowned.
You can do this, should be a piece of cake. That's right, Lady Porum,
Leonora nodded.
Such a task should come naturally to a talent like you. Then you would better put up or shut up.
Palom barked, spinning around to face Leonora and causing her to squeal when she saw the rabid sneer on his face.
White magic is supposed to be your specialty, right? What kind of epopt can't multicast a mid-level spell like Reflect? All of them?
Leonora began, but Palom held up his hand, shaking his head.
Don't wanna hear it. Consider this a test, or you can no longer be my student. What?
Leonora shrieked. Theodore turned away, willing his heart to calm itself as he hesitantly sheathed his blade. I promised Mother I would protect all of us when I accepted Excalibur, an oath I will never break, no matter how afraid I might be. So, I have to try. If I don't, it could be a matter of life and death. The other young mages had seemed to reluctantly reach the same conclusion as Theodore.
Okay, let's do this.
Porum cried, closing her eyes.
Palom, Luca, Sid, Yang, gather around me. Evelyn 4.
Leonora murmured, and the ninjas flocked over to her, Izayoi giving Leonora a wink that made the girl's cheeks stain with red before she closed her eyes. Rosa fled to Cecil and Rydia's side as the two of them were struggling to their feet, calling for Cain to follow her. Edge disappeared in a puff of smoke and reappeared at Rydia's side, sliding under her other arm so he could help Cecil lift her from the floor. Theodore felt his eye twitch as Ursula marched straight up to him, her hands on her hips.
I'm counting on you, keep in mind this is the only time I'm going to let you play the dashing knight. Wait, what?
Theodore squeaked.
I don't. Don't you have a spell to cast?
Ursula growled, and Theodore nodded quickly, closing his eyes as Harley, Edward, and Golbez made their approach. Theodore felt a heavy hand clamp down on his shoulder as he tried to begin the arduous process of wiping his mind clean. A calm baritone that sank into his blood like a sedative washed over him dreamily as he felt the crushing weight of the fear in his chest grow lesser and lesser. It was dim, and slight, but nonetheless, he could feel it, a gentle light thrumming against the curve of his neck like a second pulse, foreign yet achingly familiar all at the same time.
Believe in your light, boy, it will never lead you astray.
Thank you, Golbez. Theodore smiled slightly. I can feel it. He's pouring his power into my very core. It's just like when Cain helped me wake up Odin. The four white mages sank into a trance, a blossoming opaline aura swirling in the center of the chamber that grew in ferocity as the intensity of their prayers escalated. Theodore could feel the otherworldly energy that was welling inside of him about to reach the brink, filling the blank space in his mind with watercolor-tinged apparitions of Edward, Harley, Ursula, Golbez, and himself, healthy and whole and bathed in a prismatic sheen that made his eyes hurt even behind the shield of his eyelids.
Reflect!
Theodore cried, lifting his hand into the air. He felt the stream of ready magic retreat from his body, a spine-tingling shriek echoing in the air as the reflective shields promptly formed around his party and the others scattered about the chamber. He felt a whoosh of breath suddenly eject from his chest, and realized his body was rapidly fatiguing from the enormous amount of mana he just had spent. As he fell forward, the visions in his mind's eye scattering into crystal dust, a dragon's roar rocked his skull, and he saw a fleeting flash of a smoke-locked daydream. The same rainbow shield that was supposed to be protecting them was encircling Bahamut's plated torso, and a dizzying maelstrom of incandescence ricocheted off effortlessly, crashing into the gardens below like a meteor.
No.
Theodore gasped, his eyes snapping open as a curtain of dusk drowned his sight.
It's
Golbez clenched his jaw as he swept down to catch Theodore before he fell, the very same vision sending a shooting pain through his temple. To the north, Cecil was paralyzed in place behind his own reflective shield, his eyes pools of sunken space as he mouthed the rest of Theodore's outburst.
A trap. Oops, forgot one last thing.
The mysterious girl stepped through another portal that had torn open next to Bahamut's hovering form, raising her hands in the air and shaking her head. Bahamut ceased his attack as he craned his neck to face her, a spill of flame flinging from between his teeth and crashing into a tower of crystal, instantly melting it into glittering sludge that burned a hole through the floor. The mysterious girl cast her own reflect spell on Bahamut, pressing her fingers to her lips as she gazed over the sea of stunned faces beneath.
It was foolish of you to show me your hand in Baron during your first encounter with the All-Father,
she sneered.
But still, I thank you for your cooperation. I admit that I may not have come up with this little idea if you hadn't shown me the power of reflect. You can resume dying now, sorry for the interruption.
She snapped her fingers, and Bahamut looked away from her, tossing his head in the air and unleashing the blistering Mega Flare spell on himself.
No.
Rosa shrieked, staggering against Cain as she craned her neck to watch Bahamut.
A spell that has been reflected once will not react to another instance of the spell. The second reflect spell is rendered null. What?
Yang cried as both he and Palom took hold of Porum before she passed out standing up. Her eyes were rolling in the back of her head as she struggled to cling to consciousness.
How could this be happening?
We landed right where she wanted us, Cecil ceded. She wanted us to deplete our white magic so that we were left defenseless.
We have to run.
Gekau gasped.
To the exit, now.
But it was too late. The boiling, popping flares of fire reverberated off of Bahamut's shield and were soaring through space right for them. Cecil let his sword clatter to the floor, clasping his hands together in prayer as he closed his eyes and uttered the only spell that he knew had any hope of saving the others. In his mind, he pictured pulsing blue lights, the clang of a stainless steel bridge that swayed slightly beneath his feet, and the golden warmth of a crystal's light that poured over panels of shiny monitors and buzzing radar maps.
Teleport.
A detonation of silver moonlight flooded the chamber from its center, swallowing the screams and bodies of their friends as Mega Flare collided with his white magic and accumulated into a world-shaking explosion that forced Cecil to his knees. The activity around him slowed to a crawl while the blast resonated in his ears. He could hear a chorus of confused wails and saw a second curtain of violet light sweep through the impact site toward him, racking his body with chills as it enveloped him. And then all at once, time's flow was restored. Cecil's face smashed into the floor as he was thrown forward, stars dancing behind his eyes.
Cecil? What did you do?
Edge choked, and Cecil pushed his hair out of his face, peering behind him. Rosa, Cain, Edge, and Rydia were still with him and staring, dumbfounded, at the now smoking, abandoned chamber. Bahamut was flapping his wings impatiently, poring over the sudden emptiness below as if he were confused about what had just transpired. Cecil turned back to the carnage that had ignited in the gardens, pressing his shaking hands against the ground. The sound of shattering crystal continued to ring through the air as the aftermath of the explosion made tremble the space around them.
I'm sorry.
Cecil lowered his head, clenching his jaw as he slammed his fist down.
The only way I could think to save them was by taking them away from here.
The smell of steel suddenly filled the air as a slender, sloping figure materialized in the afterglow of the violet light, a gleaming scimitar cocked in her hand as she stepped away from a huddling pair of figures that had been obscured by a drifting billow of crystal dust. She took a few purposeful strides toward Bahamut's hulking form, her canary gown whipping between her legs as a growl rumbled deep from within her chest.
Bahamut. Ashura.
Rydia gasped, her jaw dropping.
What are you doing here?
She hadn't remembered summoning the queen, not that she could recall anything that had been running through her brain just seconds before when she thought she was about to die. The first figure Ashura had been shielding suddenly rolled over onto his back, letting out a painful moan as a spill of black fluttered over the floor. It was Golbez, and sprawled beneath him was Theodore, curled into a fetal position from when Golbez had thrown him down to cover him from Bahamut's attack.
Oh my gods,
Rosa murmured.
Did Ashura shield us from Bahamut and Cecil's magic?
All Cecil could do was shake his head in confusion, the consequences of his rash decision slowly starting to sink in. They had suddenly been reduced from a mighty army of 20 to a half-functioning party of 7, and he knew there was no way he could possibly call the others back, even if he wanted to. The pulsing energy of their very souls that he had been able to sense with ease thanks to his Lunarian blood had completely dissipated. It was as if someone had slammed the window shut in Cecil's mind that had let their vitality freely pass through to him. And with Porum and Leonora's mana most likely depleted beyond recovery, he had left them defenseless, to W wherever they were. He had tried to picture the lunar whale based on his memories from 17 years prior when he had cast the spell, but how successful could he have been if he hadn't even managed to teleport everyone in the first place? He had never fooled himself into thinking he was even a quarter of the mage Rosa was, but this... Oh, this was a disaster. Azura, who was totally ignoring them at this point, was waving her sword threateningly toward the wyvern.
My lord. This moon is not the one to which you belong. You waste your time.
The mysterious girl snorted. She gave her fingers another snap, and Bahamut promptly dispensed a barrage of flames over Azura.
Your Majesty!
Rydia cried, scrambling to her feet.
You mustn't.
Suddenly, a tidal wave poured onto Azura from above, swirling around the queen in a fortress of transparent bubbles. She burst through the raging waters as the fire gave way steam, soaked to the bone but triumphant over Bahamut's attempt to end her. Leviathan materialized by her side, his stocking cap sliding off the back of his head sleepily as he crossed his arms over his chest.
Bahamut. It is I, your son. Your Highness.
Rydia gaped. Now she was positive she hadn't summoned either of them. Leviathan turned to Rydia, shaking his head.
If he remains under her control, then we have no choice, we will fight back. Rydia. You must be willing to go to the lengths for Bahamut of which you were willing for Azura and I when we would not come to our senses. I can't fight Bahamut.
Rydia protested.
And I certainly can't do what you are suggesting. Had things gone differently, I would not have been able or willing to take your lives. I realize that now.
Bahamut cast another Mega Flare spell, this time with the King and Queen of Eidolons in his crosshairs. Leviathan threw up a wall of water, but his magic only managed to buy them a few moments of time. Bahamut's spell would not be stymied, and eventually penetrated the waves, pushing the waters to their boiling point. Leviathan fell back, his arms trembling as he struggled to hold the scalding water back from himself and Azura. Just as his strength began to fail him, Edge darted between the Eidolons and the wave, his back toward the spell as he extended his cloak of flame.
Edge!
Rydia screamed.
Get away from there!
The blistering waters crashed upon Edge, throwing him against Leviathan and Azura as the fibers of his cloak glowed in rivers of pulsing crystalline veins, absorbing the water and transforming it into pure energy that seeped into Edge's marrow. He whirled around, his blue-gray eyes scintillating with brilliance as he reached for his belt and pulled out a small glass vial. He popped the cork off with his thumb, reaching with his other hand to the crystal inlaid at the neck of his cloak and removing something sleek and green that he swiftly stuffed into the vial. What in the world is he doing? Rydia blinked. He then reeled back, launching the vial through the air into impossible heights thanks to his overflowing strength and watching with a slight smirk as it smashed cleanly between Bahamut's eyes, pearl-streaked smoke and emerald orbitals of light enveloping the wyvern's maw while he thrashed fiercely and unleashed a terrible scream. While Bahamut was distracted, Rydia ran to Edge, grabbing hold of his arm.
What the hell was all that? Smelling salts. Old Eblanese recipe Aoi has been perfecting for me as of late. Not just that.
Rydia huffed.
What's with the cape? I thought you were fixing to get yourself killed. Oh, this.
Edge grinned, spinning in a circle.
I'll be happy to catch you up later if we survive this. It's nice to see you show an interest in what I've got going on, for once. You guys.
Kane warned as Azura and Leviathan looked at each other, exchanging looks of disbelief.
This isn't over yet.
The mysterious girl was getting impatient as well. She had been fanning away the smoke from that trash the imbecile had pitched at Bahamut, her throat itching from the overwhelming spill of hyacinth and mist that now permeated the air. She clenched her fist, hissing between her teeth.
Enough of these silly parlor tricks. Just finish them off, already.
But this time, instead of turning back to his targets, Bahamut blinked sleepily through the fading haze of the smelling salts, looking at the mysterious girl as if she had spoken Greek.
What?
She barked. Bahamut responded by unhinging his jaw and spewing a discharge of flames over the girl. She fell to her knees in midair, clawing at her torched dress to try to smother the fire and shaking her head frantically.
No. No.
Bahamut drew back, snorting out a surge of smoke that rushed into her lungs, causing her to gag on her screams and break down into a massive coughing fit as the flames continued to dance around her.
You dared to believe you had rule over our eidolons. What?
The mysterious girl choked, her burning hair falling out in blackened clumps over her shoulders as heat blisters exploded on her porcelain skin. Rydia couldn't bear to look any longer. She turned away, burying her head in Edge's shoulder as he pulled her against him and kept watch, something very dark inside of him enjoying this show after that girl had forced him to witness his parents' demise all over again.
My eidolons are much more than mere pawns of power. Does the true light reside within you? Bahamut, father of all eidolons, shall deliver your final judgment.
He drew his head back, the girl's hair and dress whipping against the vacuum of wind as he drew in a readying breath, another spill of liquid flame dripping between his ivory teeth.
Reflect.
The mysterious girl whimpered, but Bahamut chuckled menacingly, the laughter rolling deep from his core.
You waste your breath.
And with that, he sprung forward, and instead of casting another spell, snapped her head off cleanly within his jaws. Rydia heard the thump of a body hitting the ground, digging her fingers into Edge's shoulder blades as she gagged. Cecil, Rosa, and Kane could only stare in shock as the remains of the girl's bloodied and burned body flopped over like a sack of flour, flecks of ash and ember rising off of what was left. Bahamut made a show of swallowing his prize and then floated down to the others, tucking in his wings as he nodded to Azura, then Leviathan. Edge patted Rydia on the back, whispering something in her ear. She slowly lifted her head, turning to face the All-Father that was looming above her and swallowing the leaden ball in her throat.
Bahamut. You are truly with us once more.
He gave a curt nod of his snout.
Rydia. We eidolons shall be with you always. Forgive my transgressions against you and your friends. I am deeply sorrowed that you and my own children had to suffer so terribly in my absence. All is forgiven, Father.
Azura waved her hand nonchalantly.
We too, were under that witch's thrall. Had Rydia and her friends not had the courage to come to this dread place, we would have never been saved. All eidolons the universe over are in her debt. Indeed,
Leviathan nodded, raising an eyebrow toward Cecil.
Righteous light is surely by your side again now, my child.
Cecil nodded weakly as he lifted his head.
This is all thanks to you, Rydia. You said that your heart was not enough. But it's your heart that links us to the eidolons, that bridges the gap between planes so that we may fight for our world as one. He speaks true,
Azura smiled.
With the All-Father and the Holy Paladin by your side, any battles you face from here on will be yours to lose.
Edge grinned, crossing his arms.
I guess this means all the actors have taken their places. Right, Rydia? Yes. I suppose so.
Rydia smiled, holding out her hand. Bahamut extended an obsidian-tipped claw, the length of just one filling Rydia's grasp as they gingerly shook on their renewed promise. Azura doused the party with healing magic before she, Leviathan and Bahamut disappeared in a shower of yellow crystal orbs. As Rosa rushed to the now-stirring Theodore and Golbez's side, Cecil, Kane, Edge, and Rydia turned toward the portal that had once been housed by the archway, now a putrid mix of bleeding blacks with an ominous throb of lightning that broke through at random every few moments. All of them carefully tried to avoid the macabre display of the mysterious girl's rotting corpse a few feet away, which was still being feasted upon by the slow burn from the remains of Bahamut's magic.
Sorry about my outburst before.
Edge stared down at his feet sheepishly.
I was just shocked, seeing everyone disappear before my eyes. For a moment, I thought Bahamut had gotten them. You did the right thing, Cecil, getting our friends out of there. You have my eternal gratitude for saving the Evelyn for the others too, of course. I don't know about that.
Cecil paled, shaking his head.
I had panicked, and now. Stop it,
Kane demanded, and Cecil looked up at him.
Had you even a second of hesitance, they would have been lost to us forever. I'm sure they're somewhere safe, and they'll figure out what to do. You don't think so little of them that they would just roll over and give up after all this, right? Of course not.
Cecil glared.
You know I don't feel that way. I just wanted to protect them. I know.
Kane sighed.
Even after all this time. Hey.
Cecil blinked, but they were interrupted when Rosa, Golbez, and Theodore made their approach.
Is everyone all right?
Rydia asked, and Theodore nodded weakly. Golbez inattentively snapped his prayer beads across his wrist, eyeing the unnerving state of the portal behind them.
There's no turning back after this,
Cecil frowned.
If anyone wants to leave, this is the time to do it.
He looked around at the others, who were all staring at him blankly.
Perhaps Azura did stop my spell before, but I'm willing to cast it again now. No questions asked, just say the word. We're not going anywhere,
Rosa smiled, placing her hand over his.
We're all in this together. Right. Yep.
Edge grinned.
Wouldn't miss this reunion for the world. There will have been no point in rescuing the Eidolons if we cannot save our home, too,
said Rydia.
They're counting on me. It's close,
Golbez growled.
I can feel it. The one behind all of this is nearby. The hatred. The despair. It's warping the very fabric of space-time itself. No more running away,
Kane said.
Come what may. I'm ready.
Cecil pressed his lips together, lowering his head. Part of him wanted to scream that they were all insane. Had they forgotten the terror that had taken hold when they had confronted Zemus? The suffering, the agony, the torment of walking that tightrope between life and death. Yes, it was true they had all survived, but looking back on it all 17 years later, it was now clear to Cecil that the 5 interlopers that set foot on the Red Moon were not the same champions that returned home. All of them had been changed in subtle, indistinct ways that had ultimately set them upon wildly different pathways in their lives, some for the better, but much, Cecil had decided, for the worse as well. I still wonder, and I fear I always will in my darkest of nightmares, what would life had been like if we hadn't been swept into the War of the Crystals? Would Kane and I had never needed to live our lives apart? Would Rosa have had to suffer at the hands of the enemy only because of her relationship with me? Would Rydia and Edge be orphans? Would I have been forced to mourn the loss of a family I had never known? His eyes fell to his son, who was staring up at him anxiously with the same haunted eyes he had always despised seeing on himself as a young man. He had hated the unwanted stares of strangers, the way his innermost thoughts always seemed to broadcast themselves in the clear blue of his gaze, the obvious contrast of his foreign coloring against that of his adoptive guardian, King Baron. It was no mystery to anyone that Cecil wasn't really part of the royal family, but for every aspect of his looks to make it so damn obvious just made it seem like the universe was spitting in his face. But when you were born, my son, those eyes no longer were just my own. Suddenly, they became the windows to a world that I could never imagine ever gazing upon with such despair, even in my darkest hours. The moment our eyes first met, Theodore, I realized what true light was, and I saw it all within you. Am I repeating a deplorable mistake, plunging you into the front lines of war? Which of your beautiful futures will I sweep away with a wave of my hand by allowing you to stay? I don't want you to ever have to question what could have been. Despite what I know you feel deep inside, I never wanted you to live a life that mirrored mine. No. I wanted precisely the opposite. I wanted you to be free. Just as Cecil was about to speak, Theodore shook his head, the boy staring his father dead in the eyes.
I'm going to. I have to see this through to the end. Not as a Red Wing, or a Lunarian, or the Prince of Baron, this goes beyond titles and bloodlines. Whoever is doing this to us, I want them to know from my lips the suffering they have wrought. I want them to look into my eyes and see the planet reflected back at them. They intend to destroy the world our people call home, humans, Lunarians, Eidolons. All of us.
Cecil closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. But the other part of me? It's so grateful to have all of you by my side. Even if it is the last time we're together like this, and the unthinkable happens. I know I would leave this world with absolutely no regrets, no matter what my nightmares may show me.
I thank you, everyone.
When Cecil stepped through the portal to the other side, he had of course no way of anticipating what could possibly be coming next. He attributed the permanent twisting feeling in his gut to general malaise about their overall situation, something he remembered feeling for the entirety of their journey through the lunar core as they chased Golbez and Fusoya to Zamu's lair. But when he saw what was waiting for them, the knot in his stomach transformed into a ball of lead that promptly sank to his core, paralyzing him in place. Behind him, he could hear the collective gasps of the others, and felt someone slam into his stunned body when he had suddenly stopped in place. They had come to a long hallway, flanked in tall, stainless steel columns that arose on each side that provided the only decor in what was an otherwise sterile environment. At its end, a door sat patiently, slightly ajar, as if someone had passed through in a hurry and hadn't taken care to pull it all the way shut. Waiting them on each side of the hall were dozens of copies of the mysterious girl, hundreds of amber headlamp eyes turned on Cecil as he drank them in turn. They were all dressed identically to the girl they had fought in the previous chamber, silken waves of hair with not a lock out of place, the same gossamer gown that hung from their shoulders like an angel's robe, and the same glimmering ruby and silver jewels dripping from their ears and necks. But despite the obvious acknowledgement that had ignited in each of the girls' eyes, none of them moved an inch, not even when the last of the party, Edge, had slipped through the portal, causing it to rapidly close behind the seven of them with an airy pop. Cecil's hand reached for his sword, but a pair of hands swiftly brushed over his sheath to block him, and Rydia slid up from behind, shaking her head quickly as she whispered.
Please? Wait. There's something different about these ones.
Cecil nodded, dropping his hand. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you looked at it, Rydia had probably spent the most time out of all of them in the presence of the mysterious girl's usual brand of terrorism. Although he had memories from his time as her puppet, none of them seemed to be distinctly of her. He remembered the voices of his friends, his own cruelty, and of course, the many, many nightmares. Rydia took a few steps forward, approaching the girl nearest to her right. The girl tilted her head as Rydia came over but said nothing. Rydia looked over her shoulder at the others, making a "now what?" face before turning back to the girl and affixing a small smile.
Hello? I'm Rydia. Do you have a name?
The girl dawdled a moment before saying anything. Her eyelids were flicking so rapidly that for a moment, Rydia was worried she would keel over right then and there from a seizure, but as the seconds dragged on, the girl began to settle down, biting her lower lip as she affixed the glow of her amber eyes onto Rydia.
I am a Maenad. We are the Maenads.
A chorus of voices suddenly added, the other girls all lifting their heads and staring straight at Rydia as they spoke. Rydia gulped, folding her fingers together to hide the shaking of her hands.
I see. What is a Maenad?
Theodore asked quietly. His voice had barely reached Rydia, but all of the girls had seemed to hear him. They lifted their chins in his direction and answered, once more, in unison.
We are the most advanced form of life. Our will is as one.
The girl in front of Rydia trailed off, and as she pressed her fingers to her lips in thought, her fellow Maenads followed suit, none of them breaking eye contact.
What one sees, we all bear witness. What is your role in all of this?
Rosa asked, and the girl closest to her answered, her eyes fixing intensely on Rosa's.
We must press forward to yet higher forms of evolution. What is our next mission?
Another Maenad asked confusedly.
Where is the next crystal we must recover?
One piped up from the rear.
Your mission is to recover crystals.
Cecil tried, but the girls had gone off on a tangent. They had started to chatter among themselves, the monotone of their identical voices filling the corridor to capacity. Rydia tried getting the Maenad's attention that she was speaking with, but the girl merely asked Rydia what her next mission was over and over until Rydia gave up, backing away.
Have they just been waiting here for someone to tell them what to do?
Kane asked.
Is there some kind of murder switch that needs turned on before they become full-blown psychopaths? I don't know.
Rydia shook her head.
But I'm inclined not to find out. Good idea.
Golbez grunted.
While they're distracted, we should get out of here. Maybe they're placated because Rydia is here,
Edge offered.
You look similar enough to be sisters. And no way,
Rydia stammered.
I don't see it. I have to say I agree with Edge,
Cecil said.
One of my last clear memories before, well, everything happened, was of Bahamut descending upon Baron and that girl leaping from his back. At first glance, I definitely thought she was Rydia. You guys are crazy.
Rydia shook her head, pleadingly looking up at Golbez for help. She could have used a dose of his stoic rationalism right about now. But he merely arched one brow, giving her a shrug as if to say,
I don't have a dog in this fight.
They proceeded through the corridor, the deadened stare of the Maenads following them even as Cecil slowly slid the door to the exit open the rest of the way and slipped inside. Golbez brought up the rear, slamming and latching the door shut behind them for good measure.
There. Now, if they try to come after us, they'll at least be slowed down a little.
Theodore's tongue had turned to sandpaper as he turned to take in their new surroundings, a nervous spasm clenching his back.
Not sure we're any safer in here, either.
The room before them was dimly lit, pale, glowing red lights could be seen hanging from the corners between tube-inlaid walls and exposed ceilings that had miles of chutes and other snaking monstrosities weaving through. The pockets of shadows in the spaces between each traffic jam of tech in the ceiling made Theodore feel as if a vampire would swing down at them from any moment to snatch him away. Expanding across the corrugated, metal-plated floor were several rows of a dozen pods, each that resembled the sleeping capsule they had settled Cecil into for their time on the lunar whale, slender steel and silver crates that resembled futuristic coffins, coils of wires extending out of each end, intertwining over the floor. Some sank into the holes drilled inside the plates at their feet, while others disappeared inside the walls. Inside each pod, a bleary white light had been installed, barely illuminating that which was contained within, a sleeping Maenad, transparent pink eyelids closed shut and each reclined against the head of the pod with a knowing smile on her lips. As in the prior corridor, all were dressed in the same white gown, adorned with the same jewels, and had identical features.
What the hell is going on here?
Kane whispered.
Is this where all of those girls came from? There isn't a single empty pod,
Edge mused, taking a stroll up and down the rows of bodies.
Do you think these are still cooking?
Edge. Rydia gasped, narrowing her eyes. She couldn't articulate why, but his comment had struck her as ridiculously vulgar. These were still people, right? They had called themselves Maenads, but they looked as human as she or him. Golbez went in the opposite direction of Edge, combing the perimeter of the rightmost pods and coming to a halt near the rear corner of the room as the whirl of glass gliding across metal suddenly filled the air.
Cecil, I think you would better see this.
Wordlessly, Cecil followed after Golbez, the others trailing behind him as their footsteps banged obnoxiously against the metal grates despite their best efforts to be quiet, making everyone cringe in anticipation of dozens of amber eyes suddenly snapping open and locking onto them. Upon reaching Golbez, Cecil had to stop himself from crying out in shock. One of the pods had slid open, and a little girl was stirring inside, her eyes fluttering open. Although she was undoubtedly a Maenad, her oversized eyes, turquoise hair, and clothing gave it away immediately. Developmentally, she was not nearly as advanced as her predecessors. In human years, she looked to only be 6 or 7 years old. A quick glance up the row of pods she had been sleeping in confirmed that she was the only one of her kind. The rest of the Maenads were adults, or at least had adult forms. She looks just like Rydia when she was a child, Cecil marveled. What is she doing here? The little girl unleashed a precious yawn that showed the full extent of her glistening white teeth. She then reached up, fumbling with a purple lacquer barrette that had slid down a stubborn lock of hair that was standing straight up in a cowlick. She eyed Golbez warily before switching her attention to Rydia, who had snuck up behind Cecil and froze in place when she saw the child.
Who are you?
Rydia pointed to herself silently, and the girl gave a nod. Yes, I'm talking to you. Flushing, Rydia rested her hands at her side. She suddenly had no idea what to do with them as to not appear as a threat and could feel her fingers awkwardly drumming against her thighs.
My name is Rydia.
The girl hopped out of the pod effortlessly, her tiny bare feet smacking the floor as she meandered over to Rydia and stared up at her. She barely made it past Rydia's knees. She was no bigger than the size of one of Luca's dolls.
Your orders, Rydia. What?
Rydia muttered, and the Maenad continued to stare up at her expectantly, never blinking. Rosa leaned in, whispering in Rydia's ear.
Maybe ask her to wait here? It's too dangerous to bring her along, don't you think?
Rydia nodded, turning back to the child and forcing a smile.
Yes. Could you stay here and be a good girl? You wish for me to remain here?
She parroted, and Rydia nodded quickly.
Right. Can you be a good girl for us?
Rydia held her breath as the Maenad scrutinized her for a few more beats. Finally, she relaxed her stance ever so slightly, gesturing toward the door none of them had noticed was behind Golbez before turning to climb back into her pod. Silently, she pressed a switch near her hip, and the glass lid sprung over her body, ensconcing her safely inside. But instead of closing her eyes to go back to sleep, she kept staring toward the door, her mouth set in a straight line of baby pink.
I think she wants us to go in there,
Theodore said.
Should we do it? We haven't much choice,
Kane frowned.
This looks to be the only way out.
Golbez unlatched the door, deciding nothing further needed to be said, and disappeared through the threshold. Theodore scrambled after him, with Cecil, Kane and Rosa following. Rydia didn't realize she was still staring at the girl until Edge gently took her arm, pulling her away.
It's going to be okay. She's safe here.
Rydia shook her head, pressing her hand to her cheek as she let Edge steer her out of the lab. She felt as if the contents of her brain had been wrung out like a sponge and plopped back into her skull, leaving her lightheaded and floaty. What the hell had they just stumbled upon?
I guess I can see the resemblance a little. We need a light,
Rydia and Edge heard Cecil say as they came up behind him in the new room, which was pitch black, even with the minute spill of red light that was bleeding in from the lab. A few seconds later, Theodore's blade emerged in the air like a banner, beads of holy essence coursing through the adamantite like tiny comets. In moments, Cecil's blade joined his son's, the pale pink curve of his sword glowing like a summer sunset as sprays of ultraviolet orbitals fell through the air like dew, exploding upon contact with the ground beneath and fading into dusk. The light of their blades had illuminated a haunting backdrop before them. Scattered in every direction, as far as their eyes could manage to see in the meager effulgence made available, were daisies carved out of pure white marble, each topped with a floating crystal that was silently spinning in place, all light extinguished. There appeared to be no ceiling, instead, they were left vulnerable beneath the velvety depths of space, a spread of pure obsidian that allowed no trace of starlight to penetrate. If there were walls that contained them, they were still too far out to see, and they could hear nothing other than their own trembling breath expelling from their lungs.
Where are we?
Rosa stared in wonder as she approached one of the daisies, the heels of her sandals clicking against the marbled steps like the ticking of a grandfather clock. She gingerly reached out, stroking the pale yellow, lusterless crystal before her. There came no reaction, nor was a trap sprung. She pulled her hand back, marveling at the trace of chill the crystal had left on her fingertips.
It's a crystal graveyard,
Golbez frowned.
There's got to be hundreds of them here, all robbed of their light, if they ever had any in the first place. Could our crystals be here, too?
Theodore blinked.
Maybe this is where the Maenads take them. It could explain why there are so many of those girls around. That's an intriguing thought.
Kane tapped his fingers against his arm.
But it's going to take hours to search this place. Hours we don't have. We have to search for an exit, anyway,
Rydia offered.
We must get our crystals back. If we have any hope of restoring our planet, it wouldn't hurt to look along the way. If we split up, I think it would go faster. What should our signal be if we find one?
Rosa hopped down from the dais she had climbed.
Should we shoot off a spell in the air? That should be sufficient,
Golbez agreed, turning on his heel.
Best get to work, then.
Cecil was investigating his 10th crystal when the first signal ignited in the air. The distance was too great, and the darkness too permeating for him to see where it had come from or who was behind it, but the spell that had been unleashed appeared to be a firework of gold and blue sparks that resembled a cure spell. It's Rosa, Theodore, or Kane, Cecil thought to himself, smiling. Maybe Theodore was onto something after all. He carefully set his sword down upon the dais, using the blade's light to guide him as he took hold of the cobalt blue crystal before him and turned it over in his hands. But after only a few seconds, he could tell right away it was not one of theirs. While it certainly resembled Mycidia's crystal of water, the shape and weight just weren't right. Cecil would never forget the feel of the crystal against his fingers, not since the day he had stolen it from the Mycidians 17 years prior and as captain of the Red Wings, had ordered his crew to slaughter all those who got in the way of their thievery. Even now, I still wonder how many lives I destroyed that misty summer morning. The seaside fog had yet to burn off from the Mycidian shores when we made our landing. That just might have bought us the time we needed to get a jump on the Elder and those hiding the crystal in the Tower of Prayer. We thought the gods were on Baron's side that fateful day. None of us had any idea that we were being manipulated by a madman on the Red Moon. Cecil heard the familiar pad of barefooted steps and spun around to find Golbez staring up at him from the base of the stairs, his arms crossed over his chest.
Golbez!
Cecil trailed off, releasing the crystal. It floated gently back into place as if it had never been disturbed at all.
Cecil,
Golbez nodded.
No luck.
Cecil shook his head, bending down to retrieve his sword while his heart hammered relentlessly inside his chest. A million different things he had wanted to say to Golbez ever since he had awoken were rushing to the forefront of his mind, trying to shove their way through to his mouth in a dizzying maelstrom. Just as Golbez turned on his heel to continue his search, Cecil stumbled down the first few steps of the dais, shouting breathlessly into the void of darkness that had fallen between them.
I am glad to see you back.
Golbez paused, and Cecil could see his hunched shoulders relaxing ever so slightly as he slowly pivoted to face him once more. Some of his dark silver hair had fallen in his face, obscuring his right eye.
And the same to you, as well.
Cecil took the next couple of steps down hesitantly, like one might do if they were luring a lost pet in the streets in an effort to not spook it. He could feel his throat clenching as he tried to find the right words. He hadn't yet come up with them in the 17 years they had been apart. Certainly he was fooling himself by thinking he would be able to now. Tell him. Tell him everything. Before it's too late again.
I cannot say for sure what our enemy was doing to my mind. But within my heart, it was as if the light was slowly fading away from me, deep inside.
Golbez stared up at him, saying nothing. Cecil finally closed the distance between them, jumping down the last few steps. On level ground, it was now he who needed to crane his neck up to make eye contact with his brother.
I felt so isolated. I was inside a world of profound darkness. However, I still had faith. Faith that Rosa and Theodore, and my friends would come to my aid. But I must admit, I certainly did not expect you to be among my saviors, even though I prayed that I would hear your voice the very morning I turned. Every night there was a full moon. I prayed then, too. Ever since we came home 17 years ago. Cecil.
Golbez trailed off, willing himself with everything he had not to turn and flee, a survival instinct he had been honing when it came to dealing with his little brother since the day they had made the gruesome discovery they were related.
I heard your prayers. But I always thought they were just dreams. Or in my case, usually nightmares. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner.
Cecil shook his head.
No, all that matters is that you came when you did. So. Thank you, my brother.
Golbez averted his eyes, sighing.
If you need to thank someone, thank Fusoya. What?
Cecil sheathed his blade, plunging the two of them into darkness.
It was he who sent me to you. Putting his own body on the line in the process. Fusoya did that. He did. So, it was Fusoya that sent you back.
Cecil covered his hand with his mouth, trying to mask the pitch of his voice. He didn't like what Golbez seemed to be implying.
And he didn't come with you.
Golbez eyed Cecil warily. It skeeved him out that even after all the hell he had been through these past few days and despite how desperate he had been to walk the path of light, if only to save his brother, he still felt safest under the cover of darkness. He wondered if Cecil had purposely extinguished the light of his sword so that he wouldn't turn tail and flee. Even so, Cecil deserved the truth, all of it. He needed little to convince himself of that much.
Yes. Fusoya. I can't say what his fate may be in all of this. I suspect sending me here to find you was part of his plan all along, maybe even since the day we went into stasis, if your theory about the ninth crystal is correct. But I promise you, Cecil, I had also had enough of hiding. Your voice was the last one I heard before I woke up. Oh.
Cecil crossed his arms.
Indeed. So, you are no longer ashamed of your name, Golbez? No,
he shook his head.
I have to live up to my sins. And myself. I told your son Theodore died a long time ago, and I truly meant it. But that doesn't mean I can't try to be the man Theodore might have become if fate had been kinder. I can't turn back time. But I have this day. And if I'm lucky, I will have it tomorrow. And if I'm really lucky, a tomorrow after that one. I know now that I can't just go to sleep and wake up to find everything I've broken, fixed. All I can do is repent one a day at a time. My son,
Cecil smiled slightly,
is your nephew, you know. Golbez's nephew, your blood. I hope that someday you'll be able to think of him as such. I care for Theodore,
Golbez said softly.
But I feel it would be too much to ask of him to think of me as anyone more than a distant acquaintance. His heart is rife with confusion, Cecil, that much I can sense. You have to remember the turbulence you felt when you discovered who you truly were, and multiply that twice over for the boy. He's young, and life at his age is hard enough for anyone, let alone a prince and the blood relation of a terrorist. I get it,
Cecil sighed, looking away.
I suppose that's some perspective I've been lacking throughout this ordeal. I do appreciate your honesty.
Golbez shook his head.
Enough of this for now. We must continue our search for the crystals. You're right,
Cecil nodded. As the words left his lips, a spell lit up the sky, another cure spell, it looked like. But this one had come in the complete opposite direction of the first. Cecil guessed that it would have only been a few rows of daisies away if that. Moments later, another spell detonated from a lower left quadrant, this one a tower of flames igniting the sky.
I'll head this way,
Golbez quickly volunteered, bolting in the direction of the fire spell before Cecil could say another word. He retrieved his sword, deciding to check on the nearby victor before continuing on. He saw a flash of green and white suddenly streak across the expanse of space before him, and lifted his blade higher, only to see Kane leaping from one dais to the next, a ruby-stained crystal tucked under his arm. Cecil picked up his speed, calling out to Kane before he leapt to the next dais and out of sight.
Cecil.
Kane whirled around, nearly dropping the crystal he had retrieved in surprise.
Sorry if I scared you,
Cecil huffed as he came to the foot of the dais, doubling over momentarily as he clutched his cramping side.
Wow, I am really out of shape. That's what sitting your arse on a throne all day will do to you,
Kane smirked, reaching to inspect the crystal. When he realized it was a dud, he turned back to Cecil, tilting his head to the right.
Let's go that way.
Cecil fell into step behind him as they silently investigated each dais they came across, giving each other a quick head shake after each one before moving on to the next. When they had finished sweeping the quadrant, Kane shrugged, flopping down onto the ground.
Okay. So I might be getting a little winded too. Want to stop for a break? Thought you would never ask,
Cecil smiled, sitting down next to him and leaning back against the cool marble of the dais. They both turned toward the unblinking sky above, hands behind their heads as the distant scuffles of the rest of their party echoed around them. Closing his eyes, Kane let out a low sigh.
It has been a while since it was just you and I, hey? Other than the terrifying feeling of being hurled through space on a death trap, this reminds me of those nights where we'd stay up all night after our missions and would wake up the next morning not remembering a thing. Ever since we arrived, everything's been happening in a blur. It certainly has,
Cecil chuckled, although his laughter died quickly as reality set back in.
I'm sorry. About what?
Kane still didn't open his eyes. Cecil pulled his legs against his chest, pressing his forehead to his knees as he took a deep breath.
I lost control of myself. And look what it has caused. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have to be here right now, Kane.
Kane shifted slightly, not saying anything. Cecil took that as an invitation to continue, although he wasn't sure if Kane could even hear him while he was moaning against his legs.
If you hadn't come down from that mountain, I would have been lost. Quit it,
Kane grunted.
In fact, without you, Theodore and Rosa would have both been beyond rescue by now.
Kane leaned over, semi-seriously smacking Cecil upside the head. Cecil's face shot up, his glare meeting Kane's as he pressed in closer.
Why do you have to blame yourself for everything? I wasn't doing it just for you, you understand? Hey. Baron is my motherland. It always has been, and it always will be. True enough,
Cecil relented.
But even so. And I have been away from it for far too long. But now you are back, right? Yes,
Kane affirmed.
Until my dying breath. If I should be so lucky. Only if the monarchy will have me back, I should say.
Cecil shook his head, rolling his eyes.
Please. Like a detail as minor as that would stop you. You're right,
Kane grinned, sitting back.
But from what I've heard, you seem to be doing a decent enough job. It would be tough to overthrow you anyway.
Cecil tilted his head, not being able to help but smile in response to Kane's infectious smirk.
It would be Theodore you would have to fight for the throne, not me. What do you think of him?
Kane's cheerfulness suddenly faded into a sober veil, and Cecil felt his heart drop into his stomach as Kane's gaze darted away from him, returning to the sky. Was Kane going to tell him something terrible? For some reason he couldn't quite put his finger on. The thought of Kane disliking Theodore made his heart ache. Maybe it was because in another life, he had hoped Kane would have been more involved in the lives of their children from the beginning. Cecil had always wanted to do the same for him, too. Kane and Rosa had been the family he had never had, until, well, he found Golbez. Kane crossed one leg over his knee, gently swinging his foot.
He has talent. In terms of both combat and magic, there is a lot there to be nurtured. He has good instincts for people, too. I dare say he's every bit as earnest as you are. Is he?
Cecil smiled, relief flooding his senses. Kane nodded.
When all of this is over, will you be asking Theodore to train as a paladin? Now that he's a Red Wing, that would be the natural progression of his talents. Ah, well.
Cecil gave a half shrug.
The truth is, Theodore has never shown much interest in such a pursuit. It was a surprise to Rosa and me that he had even tried out for the Red Wings. It's not that I ever doubted his ability, perhaps I was taken aback by his will. I always told myself that I would never push becoming a paladin upon Theodore and wait for him to come to me if it was something he wanted to do. I don't know if that was the right approach, but Theodore will become a fine king one day, whether or not he is a paladin,
Kane said.
The tools that forge great leaders are not born from titles and wars won, everything that is most important lies here.
He pressed his fingers to his chest.
So yes, I think you did the right thing. I know that a boy as lucky as he to have you as his father will have the strength of heart to overcome any challenge he may face. I suppose that stubborn streak of his comes from Rosa, though, there is little doubt who his mother is. Ha! Perhaps.
Cecil closed his eyes, enjoying the soothing chill of the marble against his scalp. For just a moment, his tightly wound nerves relented and allowed him to conjure a peaceful memory from when he was Theodore's age. It had been a rare night off for both he and Kane, before he had joined the Red Wings, and when Kane was still just a squire among the dragoons whom had not yet rocketed to superstardom. They had decided it would be a great idea to sneak out of the castle for the night and camp in the southern woods. After a night of foolish pranks and dares, including an embarrassing wild chocobo riding contest that resulted in the loser, Cecil, getting a hastily pierced ear courtesy of Kane and a cactuar needle, the two of them had foregone their tent to sleep under the stars. Baron, 22 years prior. Cecil remembered the light of the full twin moons managing to pierce even the densest of the forest's trees, leaving funny streaky shadows on Kane as he rolled over to finally get some sleep. Kane had been getting quieter and quieter after he had managed to pin Cecil down long enough to pierce him and had patiently, but silently mopped up the blood while Cecil wailed like an infant through the pain. Thinking he had perhaps made Kane feel bad for his being so sour about the bet he had agreed upon, Cecil shyly opened his eyes, flopping back over to see if Kane was still awake.
What's up?
Kane asked before Cecil could even breathe a word. His back was turned to Cecil, shoulder-length corn silk hair splayed in a puddle of moonlight that turned it into a brilliant platinum. Cecil idly mused that he and Kane could have been twins, but only in a world where the moons shone with such brilliance 24/7. Oh, and if Cecil also managed to grow about a foot taller.
Ah. Just wanted to say sorry about giving you so much trouble about the bet. It didn't hurt that bad, so please forget all of my incessant whining tonight.
His ear throbbed as he choked out that last sentence, reminding him what a terrible liar he was. Kane shifted, his narrowed eyes peering at Cecil from over his shoulder.
And tell me why one would feel compelled to apologize about something as ridiculous as feeling pain.
Cecil blinked, not expecting to answer a question like that. But he knew Kane wouldn't let it go until he said something, so he let the first thought that fluttered into his mind fly out of his mouth.
You're my only friend, well, besides Rosa, that is, that I care about being annoyed with me. You got quiet after the bet, so I thought maybe I had done something to make you mad. And I just...
He trailed off, shaking his head.
I don't know. I'm not mad,
Kane said, finally shifting onto his side so that he could face Cecil directly. Even though he had a small smile on his lips, his eyes were still cold, distant.
I just realized something that took me by surprise, and it shook me a little, I suppose. What?
Cecil sat up worriedly.
Do we have to go back to the castle? No, no,
Kane shook his head, smiling more.
I just forgot what day it was.
What day it was? Cecil chewed his lip, and you could see the wheels turning in his head behind his wide, cerulean eyes. Try as he might, he couldn't figure out what Kane could possibly be referring to. Kane amused himself for a few moments by watching Cecil dither about before finally breaking the silence.
It's the anniversary of my father's death. For the first time since it happened? I totally forgot. Oh, Kane.
Cecil stared down at the smashed grass where their bodies had been.
I'm really sorry. Don't be,
Kane shook his head quickly.
It's a good thing, Cecil. It means I'm finally moving on, and not obsessing over what happened with every waking minute. I was able to forget because I was so excited to just be with you today and just do something normal. What?
Cecil felt his cheeks turn pink.
You call torturing your best friend normal? What kind of psycho are you? Heh.
Kane winked.
You should ask what that says about you if you call someone like me your best friend.
Cecil snorted out a laugh, smashing his fist into Kane's arm. But even that small effort made his ear shoot into a frenzy of pain, and he let a small scream escape as he fell back, cradling the side of his face.
Ow.
Kane blanched at the sight of Cecil trembling before him.
You actually don't look very well, maybe we should get you back. No.
Cecil half laughed, half moaned as he made a show of sliding back down into the grass.
If I sleep on my other side, it will be just fine. But you'll check on me to make sure I'm breathing later, right?
Kane laughed airily, flopping down alongside Cecil and shoving his foot into his back.
Yeah. I'll make sure you don't drop dead. I'm serious,
Cecil muttered.
I'm counting on you, Kane. I'm being serious, too. I'm not going to let my best friend down. Thank you.
Kane felt his chest clench when he looked over at Cecil after several beats of silence and saw that his eyes were closed, his alabaster skin reflecting the pale marble of the dais, wearing the same small smile he had occasionally sported while in a coma. He leaned in, gently shaking Cecil's shoulder, not able to control the tremble in his voice.
Cecil.
He felt Cecil stir beneath his hand and pulled back, trying not to laugh out of relief. He had merely fallen asleep. Of course. How could I forget Cecil's uncanny ability to sleep most anywhere? He watched as an explosion of magic suddenly lit up the sky, a thunder spell, if he was placing it correctly. Another crystal found. We're officially halfway there. I guess I could let Cecil rest a little while longer. I know, after I awoke from being under Golbez and Zemus's thrall, I was exhausted from losing control over my body. I had to learn how to function all over again. I'm sure it must be much of the same for him after breaking free from the wretched girl. There was so much more I wanted to tell you, but for now, I'll just have to hope that we'll have another tomorrow together.
We have to stop this moon,
Kane sighed to himself as he stood up. He figured he could explore the dazes surrounding Cecil with relative ease while still being able to keep an eye on him. Cecil's head slid down the marble slightly, the glimmer of a pearl earring winking beneath the spill of his hair.
I'll be counting on you, Kane,
he murmured in his sleep. Kane turned to face him, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat as he watched the hypnotic rise and fall of Cecil's breath in his chest.
And I will not let you down.
The last person in their group to locate a crystal was Golbez. After igniting a final fire spell to announce his find, the others gathered to him from across the graveyard, laying their finds in a row on the ground so everyone could investigate.
I see you found the most,
Edge said dryly as Golbez set down 3 crystals, 2 crystals of darkness and the crystal of earth. Golbez met Edge's stare with a smirk, noticing that he had come back empty-handed.
Well, I do have a nose for such things.
Awkward, Theodore muttered, relinquishing the crystal of wind. It was followed by Rose's crystal of water, Kane's crystal of fire, and Cecil and Rydia's crystals of darkness.
These are all definitely our planet's crystals,
Cecil sighed, picking up each one. As he did, a faint glow would emanate from the very depths of the crystal's core, only to die as soon as he set it back down.
But they're just like the rest. Their light has been vanquished. Is this the work of the Maenads? Perhaps so. But what do they do with them to rob them of their light?
Rosa shook her head.
What's the purpose of this madness? That's the million-gil question,
Kane shrugged.
And here's another, did anyone manage to find an exit in their wanderings?
His query was met with silence.
Damn,
Edge breathed.
I don't want to die in a creepy place like this. Surely this isn't the last stop. That little girl from the lab might know where to go next to restore the light to the crystals,
Rydia said slowly.
If we, gave her orders to tell us. Do you think she would? It's worth a shot,
Cecil nodded.
I think some of us should stay here and guard the crystals, and the rest can see the girl. I'm worried about what might happen if we bring these into the lab. What if the other Maenads wake up and lose it?
I'll stay with the crystals, Theodore offered, nodding toward his sword, which he was still using as a torch in the suffocating darkness of the graveyard.
If I walk another step, I think I'll keel over. I just need a short rest. I'll join Theodore,
Golbez said.
The rest of you can see to the girl.
Edge shot Cecil a not-so-subtle look that screamed,
Are you seriously going to let this happen?
Cecil mutely shook his head, holding up a hand in warning for Edge not to start anything. Golbez turned away from Edge, his mouth twisting as he drummed his fingers over his forearm.
Very well,
Cecil said, turning on his heel and gesturing for Edge and the others to follow him.
Let's go.
I have to trust Golbez. He said he wanted to fix this. His contrition rang true when we spoke. If I can't believe in him, how can I possibly expect the rift in our family to ever heal? Theodore watched as his parents and the others were absorbed into the darkness, not allowing himself to sit until their footsteps had faded away. Golbez took his position across from Theodore, pressing his back up against the dais from which he had relieved the final crystal. Phew. Theodore cradled his head in his hands, relishing the feeling of his eyelids shutting out the light of his blade as he closed his eyes. He was so tired that he didn't bother giving the idea of Golbez being his babysitter a second thought, although he had caught the soul-wrenching glare Edge had served up to his father before they had left. It both comforted and disturbed him that there was still someone in his father's inner circle beside himself that still wasn't quite sure what to make of Golbez's renewed presence in their lives. If I can even just get a few moments of sleep, I think I'll feel much better. My fever is back. My head is killing me. Ever since I found the crystal of wind, my limbs have felt like there are chains weighing them down. And I still need to tell Father about that dream. I'll make do it when he comes back. Just a small nap, first. Darkness. Light. In the end, none of it matters. I will save you from this agony. That which comes from each breath leading you closer still to death. Come. I will show you true eternity, the crux of your evolution begins now. Theodore's eyes snapped open as a menacing pain shot across his forehead. A flash of red bled into his vision, and he fell forward, his face smashing into one of the crystals and ushering forth a gush of blood from his nose. My head. It feels like it's being split in two. Why?
Golbez.
Theodore whimpered, the metallic tinge of his blood mixing with crystal dust drowning his tongue in brackish grit. He could no longer feel the rest of his body, from the neck down, a numbing paralysis had taken hold of his muscles, turning them into slabs of ice.
Help.
But there came no reply. Theodore lifted his half-closed eyes, his vision a swirling blur of red bleeding into black as he tried to spot Golbez. He could have sworn that just a few minutes ago, he was standing right there. Had he imagined it all? Where did everyone go? As the blood steadily dripped from Theodore's face onto the crystals below, he noticed for the first time that they had been arranged in a circle and had all begun to glow with a faint light that faded in and out with the rhythm of Theodore's heart. Etchings of blue raced across the cracks in the moonscape, igniting into a magic circle that looked suspiciously like the runes inlaid on the crystal plate that had led them to the Dark Knight's hiding place. No. Theodore clenched his eyes shut, a dry wail escaping his throat as he felt his numbed limbs suddenly start to stir. His hands were digging into the ground to steady himself in preparation to stand, but he wasn't the one issuing the command to his body. Stop. Golbez grunted as ripped his sword out of the velveteen coat of the behemoth, a spray of blood streaking his feet as the monster flopped over on its side and began to dissolve into milky-colored ash. Exhaling sharply, Golbez sheathed his weapon and swiped the sweat-matted hair out of his face. The behemoth had come from seemingly nowhere. One moment, Golbez had been watching Theodore drift off to sleep, and the next, he had felt the unmistakable chill of impending danger entangle itself around his neck, setting his hair on end. Someone, or something, was watching them, and a stealthy cut of his eye over his shoulder had confirmed as such. The creature was crouched just a dais away, fangs glimmering with saliva as it prepared to make its strike. Golbez had launched himself over the empty crystal dais, his sword withdrawn by the time he had landed, and blew the behemoth away with a bio spell to knock it a greater distance from the slumbering prince. In just a few moments, the battle ended when Golbez had managed to stun the monster with a stop spell and impale him from behind, plunging his ebony blade into its muscled chest cavity until he felt the shudder of its heart bursting within. A wicked blaze of light suddenly washed over Golbez from behind, blowing a rush of hot hair over the graveyard. As he turned, he spotted Theodore staring confusedly at a rune that had blossomed at the center of the crystals, his eyes black pits as he took a few stumbling steps forward.
Theodore!
Golbez called, his heart leaping into his throat.
Wait!
But it was too late. Theodore's eyes flickered in recognizance of Golbez's voice just as he stepped upon the rune, another wave of light tearing through the graveyard that swallowed him whole. His body disappeared through the center of the rune, remnants of starlight tumbling through the air where he had been standing just seconds before. Rydia's hand grasped the door handle that would take them back to the little girl when the first assault of luminescence hit. Cecil and Kane pivoted around, each lifting their shields as the untamable gale slammed into them, and Edge wrapped himself into his cloak, the smoldering wind absorbing into his body harmlessly.
Where is it coming from?
Rydia cried, and Kane wordlessly pointed due north. A column of twisting blue light had erupted that pierced the sky, one that looked disturbingly familiar to the dragoon as he recalled the night he had found Theodore half dead in the meadowlands beyond Mysidia's borders.
We have to go back!
Rosa shrieked, shoving past Cecil and Kane before either one could reach out and grab her. Cecil lowered his shield, and Kane cursed under his breath, taking off after her into the beckoning black. His hands shaking, Cecil quickly sheathed his blade and gestured for Rydia and Edge to follow him. The second influx of light hit, and Cecil could see Rosa and Kane's shadows darting between the daisies, the crystals floating all around them temporarily ablaze with brilliance and projecting dizzying rainbow prisms over the landscape. A sloping figure was bolting toward the column of light from the opposite direction, screaming something Cecil couldn't comprehend over the roar of the wind. He urged his legs to carry him faster, tears stinging the corners of his eyes from the relentless burn of his breath churning in and out of his oxygen-starved lungs. When he had managed to catch up to Rosa and Kane, Cecil could now see the figure bending down to pick something up. The indisputable glint of adamantite reflected off the light, and Cecil realized it was Excalibur, but its owner was nowhere to be seen. As the column of light began to fade and pool into a crudely edged rune into the ground, Cecil saw Golbez sling Excalibur over his back, his cloak fluttering as he leapt onto the rune.
Wait!
Cecil cried, extending his hand. But Golbez disappeared seconds later, another pillar of light shooting into the endless sky above them as he was carried away into space.
Theodore!
Rosa wailed, skidding to a stop when she reached the rune and immediately spotting the crystal among the circle that was covered in blood. She sniffled as she picked it up, turning it over in her fingers for any sign of foul play. Cecil collapsed down beside her, and she shakily handed him the crystal, her eyes spilling over and her lips quivering. The bloodied crystal was the crystal of water. Cecil clenched his jaw as he felt the jewel's meager warmth fill his hands, a drop of blood sliding down its face and splashing onto Cecil's armor. This is Theodore's blood. Of that I have no doubt.
What the hell is going on?
Edge gasped, coming up from the rear where he had been carrying Rydia on his back. She hopped down, her hand clutching for her whip.
We have to move. I saw a herd of behemoths trampling through this way, they're pouring into this place like a flood. Damnation!
Kane growled, bending down and starting to scoop crystals into his arms.
We've got no other choice, to the rune. We have to chase after Golbez and find Theodore.
The others quickly scrambled to grab a few crystals of their own, until all 8 had been accounted for. Cecil pulled Rosa to her feet, shoving her into the rune with him as the foreign, ancient carvings tracing the parameter began to pulse at their feet. She pressed her head to his chest, securing her crystal between the two of them as he embraced her with all of his strength, burying his lips in her hair. The ground disappeared beneath them, and they were falling away into nothingness. To be continued in the final tale, Somnus. End of chapter.